The desert town smelled of dust and old blood. Spring 1880, Arizona territory. A crowd gathered outside the saloon the way crowds gather for a hanging loose, curious, ready to look away the second it turned ugly. On a wooden crate in the dirt stood a young woman, rope loose around her wrists. She did not look at her feet. She looked past the hats, past the horses, straight toward the hills, as if her body had simply not yet caught up with the place her spirit already lived. The auctioneer called a price, insultingly low, the kind of number a man paid for a limping mule. Silence. No one moved. Then a voice cut through the stillness. Low. Flat. Carrying the way a gunshot carries when everything else goes quiet around it. A hand rose in the crowd and did not come down. Another number. The hand stayed. Higher. Still raised. The whole street held one collective breath, waiting for the moment that strange, quiet hand would finally lower. It never did. Redstone Flats did not smell like a town. It smelled like a wound that never closed. Dust and coal smoke and something sweeter underneath. Something like blood that had dried on wood and never been scrubbed out. Spring, 1880. Arizona territory. The kind of place men came to disappear and women came to be sold. It had grown up fast and crooked around a played-out silver strike a decade back, the way such towns always did. Half its buildings still wearing the raw, unweathered look of lumber thrown up faster than good sense would allow. A single dusty main street ran its length. Saloon and assay office and feed store and bank all crowded close together as if huddling for warmth against a country that offered none. Beyond the last buildings, the land opened up flat and pale and merciless clear to the hills, the kind of horizon that made a person feel very small and very exposed, whether they'd done anything to deserve that feeling or not. The crowd gathered outside Kane's saloon the way crowds gather for a hanging. Loose, curious, ready to look away the second it got ugly. A wooden crate sat in the dirt. On top of it stood a girl. She did not look at her feet. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Girls on that crate usually looked at their feet. This one looked straight out, over the hats, over the horses, out toward the hills like she was already somewhere else, and her body just hadn't caught up yet. Her name was Leon Jo, 22 years old. Rope loose around her wrists, more for show than for holding, hair black and unbound, catching the wind off the flats. She wore a dress 2 sizes too big, borrowed or stolen or handed down, it didn't matter which. What mattered was the silence, because nobody was bidding, not because she was ugly, she wasn't. Not because she looked weak, she didn't. Nobody bid because of what she was. Chinese. And in Redstone Flats in the spring of 1880, that word did more work than any auctioneer ever could. Otis Kane stood beside the crate with a ledger in one hand and a whiskey-cured voice in the other. He called the opening price low, insultingly low, the kind of number you'd pay for a mule with a limp. Nobody moved, because that was the arithmetic of it, plain as the dust on every boot in that street. A price that low should have drawn a dozen hands, should have started a small war of raised fingers and shouted numbers, the way it did for horses, for land, for anything a man in Redstone Flats actually wanted to own. Instead, the crowd just watched, arms crossed, the particular stillness of people who have already decided the answer before the question finishes being asked. A woman near the front, wife of the feed store owner, pulled her young daughter's face against her skirts and turned them both away, not out of mercy, only so the girl wouldn't ask questions later that the mother didn't want to answer. A pair of miners passing through leaned against the hitching post and traded a low joke that made them both laugh, ugly and quick, before falling back into the general silence like stones dropped into still water. Even Kane's own dog, tied near the saloon depths, had stopped barking, as if it too understood there was nothing here worth making noise about. Leon could feel every one of those silences differently. She had learned over 3 long years that silence came in more flavors than most people ever bothered to notice. There was the silence of shame, which sometimes rarely tasted almost like an apology. There was the silence of simple cruelty, which tasted like nothing at all, like a held breath before a slap. And there was this silence, the Redstone Flats kind, which tasted like arithmetic, like a whole street doing sums in its head and arriving, every single one of them, at the same small, ugly number. Somewhere in the crowd a man laughed, short, ugly, the kind of laugh that isn't about anything funny, just about being safe enough to laugh at someone who can't laugh back. "Come on now," Kane said, working the crowd like a man working a dying fire. Cooks. Shoes. Speaks English good enough. Somebody here needs a woman who works. Still nothing. A rancher near the back lifted his hand halfway, just halfway, like testing water before deciding whether to drown in it. Someone beside him muttered something low, something about the tongs, something about bad luck following her kind home, and the hand came down before it ever finished rising. He didn't even look ashamed. That was the part that would stay with anyone watching. He didn't even look ashamed. Lyon did not flinch. She had trained her face for exactly this. Somewhere behind her eyes, though, a single thought kept looping, quiet and relentless. Do not cry, not here, not in front of these people. You promised her. You promised your mother. You would not die like something owned. Except a promise doesn't keep you warm. Except a promise doesn't stop a stranger's hand from closing around your arm. Except a voice cut through the crowd. Low. Flat. Carrying the way a gunshot carries. Not because it's loud, but because everything else goes quiet around it. $50. Heads turned. He'd come from the shadow between two buildings, from the direction of the livery, leading a bay, gelding by the reins like he had all the time in the world. And none of it was for them. Tall, sun-worn. A gray Stetson pulled low enough that you had to work to see his eyes, and once you saw them, you understood why he kept them hidden. There was nothing cruel in them. That almost made it worse. Cruelty you could explain. This was something else. This was a man who had already lost the thing he was afraid of losing, and had nothing left that fear could touch. His name was Silas Merrick. He ran a spread called Iron Hollow, out past the wash, alone since. Kane's mouth opened like a drawer sliding out of a desk. 50 from Merrick, he called, too fast, too eager, the way a man sounds when he's been handed away out of an awkward silence. Somewhere in the crowd, the earlier logger found his nerve again. Merrick's gone soft, he called out, buying himself a China doll. Silas did not turn his head. 60, he said. A pause. Then from the crowd, meaner this time, 70, and I'll throw her back after. The words landed like a slap. Leon's spine went rigid on the crate, chin lifting a half-inch, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Silas turned then. Just his head. Just enough to find the man who'd said it somewhere in the crowd's middle rows and look at him. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. The look did the work a fist usually does, and the man's grin curdled and died on his face, and he found something very interesting to study on the ground. Aedilis said, facing forward again, voice never rising, never dropping. Steady as a heartbeat that refuses to skip. Kane, sensing blood, sensing profit, called for more. Someone shouted a number just to hear themselves shout it. Someone else laughed. The whole ugly carnival of it kept turning, kept grinding. And through it all, Silas Merrick kept his hand raised and his eyes forward, and every single time a number came at him, he answered with a bigger one and did not blink and did not look away and did not once lower his hand. That was the thing people would say about him later, the thing that would follow him around town like a brand. Silas Merrick doesn't lower his hand. Not once he's decided. He hadn't decided to buy a wife. He hadn't decided anything. Really, except that 4 years ago he'd stood at the edge of a flooded wash and watched the water take something he loved, and he had promised himself, in the roaring dark of that night, that he would never again stand still while somebody drowned in front of him. Even if this particular drowning wore a different face. Even if this particular water was made of dust and men's voices instead of a swollen creek. Even. 110, Kane called, breathless now, sensing the whole thing tipping towards something he didn't fully understand but knew, on instinct, not to interrupt. Silence. Going once. Going twice. Somewhere a horse stamped. Somewhere a fly droned against the saloon glass. The whole town seemed to be holding one collective breath, waiting to see if the strange, quiet man with the raised hand would finally lower it. He didn't. Sold, Kane said, and the word cracked out over the crowd like a whip. Sold to Silas Merrick. Nobody cheered, nobody clapped. A few men spat in the dirt like the whole thing had left a bad taste, and a few women pulled their shawls a little tighter and looked away, and one old woman near the back, Chinese herself, kept quietly out of sight the way most of them were kept. Quietly, out of sight, pressed a hand over her mouth and did not move for a long moment, watching. Silas walked forward, handed over nearly every dollar he had, folded and worn soft from years in a saddlebag, and did not count it twice, did not haggle, did not so much as glance at Kane's smug little smile. He climbed the 2 steps to the crate, Up close, Leanne was smaller than she'd looked from the crowd. Smaller and somehow made of iron anyway. He drew a knife, slow, deliberate, making sure every eye in that crowd saw exactly what he was doing and exactly why. So there would be no mistake about it later. The story twisted sideways in the retelling. He cut the rope. It fell into the dust between them, like something already dead. "You're free," he said. Quiet enough that only she could really hear it, though the whole street strained to. "Ride with me or walk. Choice is yours." Leon looked at him. Something happened behind her eyes then. Something the crowd couldn't see and wouldn't have understood if they had. Not gratitude, exactly. Something harder to name. Something like recognizing a language she hadn't heard spoken correctly in 3 years. "Why?" she said. Not really a question. More like a test. "Don't know yet," Silas said, honest in a way that cost him something. "Ask me again in a week." For the first time since the crate, since the crowd, since the rope, something in her shoulders loosened. Not trust. Not yet. Just a fraction of the weight coming off. She stepped down without his hand to help her. Didn't need it. Wouldn't have taken it anyway. They rode out of Redstone Flats as the sun dropped low and orange behind the hills. The whole street still watching, still murmuring, still working the story over in their mouths like a piece of gristle they couldn't quite chew through. A woman bought free instead of bought owned. Nobody in that town had a box to put that in. At the edge of the street, just past the last building, the old Chinese woman who had watched from the back of the crowd stepped forward, quick and quiet, and pressed something small into Leanne's hand as the horses passed. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Leanne looked down and found a tiny paper packet, folded corner to corner the careful way her grandmother used to fold things that mattered, and inside it, a pinch of dried tea leaves, more symbol than substance, the kind of gift a person gives when they have almost nothing left to give and refuse on principle, to give nothing at all. Leanne looked back once. The old woman had already turned away, disappearing into the thinning crowd. Her part in this story finished before it had properly begun. But the small paper packet sat warm in Leon's closed fist the whole ride out of town, and something about it, the weight of it, the deliberate care of the fold, steadied something in her chest that the last hour had badly shaken. Not everyone had looked away. She would remember that later, on harder nights than this one. Not everyone had looked away. Behind them, dust settled slow over the empty crate. The ride to Iron Hollow would take the better part of 3 days, riding the long way around the dry hills, because the short way crossed land Silas didn't trust anymore. Land that had a name now, and the name was Thorn. They didn't talk much that first day, which suited them both fine, or at least that's what they each told themselves. Because talking meant explaining, and explaining meant remembering. And Leon was not ready to hand a stranger her memories the way she'd just been handed briefly, terribly, to a whole street full of them. She rode a little behind him, on a mare he'd borrowed from a neighbor for the trip, and she watched the line of his shoulders the way you'd watch a storm cloud, waiting to see which way it would break. He didn't break, didn't do much of anything except ride, and check the horizon every so often with the particular squint of a man who has learned, the hard way, that horizons lie. They camped that night in a dry wash lined with mesquite, and he built the fire small, and he set his bedroll a good 10 feet from hers, and this she noticed filed away, did not comment on. He left his pistol lying between them. Not pointed at her, not pointed at anything, just there, within her reach if she needed it, which told her something about him that his silence hadn't. She lay on her back and looked at more stars than she'd seen since Guangdong, since the boat, since the long gray months after, and she let herself think, just for a moment, about home, about her mother's hands wrapped around hers the night before she left, about the promise made in that small room with the smell of ginger and coal smoke, about stop, don't. If you start now, you won't stop. And this is not the place, this is not the night. This man 10 feet away does not need to see you. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes until the stars blurred and steadied and blurred again. And by the time she lowered it, her face was dry. She had promised. She kept promises. Across the fire, Silas wasn't sleeping either. He was watching the small motion of her shoulders in the firelight, the way they'd gone tight and then, slowly, come loose again. And he recognized that particular fight because he'd fought it himself, more nights than he could count, in the 4 years since Callie. He hadn't said the name out loud in longer than he could remember. Didn't say it now either. Just let it sit in his chest where it always sat. A stone that had stopped being sharp-edged, only because he'd carried it so long the edges had worn down to something almost bearable. She'd died in a wash, not unlike this one. Different season, different water. A flash flood roaring down out of the hills faster than anybody expected, and a mining camp laborer, a Chinese man. Name lost now to everyone but Silas, who had made himself remember it, made himself say it silently every year on the day caught out on the wrong side of the water when it came. Thorne's riders had chased that man into the wash. Chased him for sport, or for spite, or because Garrett Thorne simply enjoyed watching men run. It never was clear which, and it didn't much matter which, because the end was the same regardless. The man went into the water, trying to escape them. And Callie, who happened to be riding the ridge above, who could have looked away, who anyone would have forgiven for looking away. Callie didn't look away. She went in after him. She got him to the bank, got him breathing, got him coughing up brown water and cursing in 2 languages, got him alive. The current took her on the way back. Silas found out 3 hours later, from a rider sent up from the camp, and something in him had gone very quiet that day and never entirely come back to noise. He hadn't been able to save her. He knew that, accepted it the way you accept a scar, the wound sealed over even if the ache never fully leaves. What he had promised himself standing over the water that took her was smaller and harder and more useful than grief. He had promised he would not, ever again, stand on dry ground and watch somebody drown while he had 2 working legs and the will to move them. A crate in a dusty street wasn't a flash flood, but drowning didn't always need water. Sometimes it just needed a crowd and silence, and nobody willing to raise a hand. So he'd raised his. He looked at the woman across the fire, finally steady, finally breathing slow and even in something like sleep, and he thought, not for the first time that day, I don't know what I've bought myself into. And then, quieter, neither did Callie. She went in anyway. He banked the fire low and lay back and did not sleep for a long while. Morning brought a different kind of silence, one with less grief and a little more curiosity riding shotgun. She caught him favoring his left shoulder while he saddled the horses. Small thing. A hitch in the reach, a wince quickly buried. She said nothing about it, not yet, only watched, the way she watched everything, cataloging. He caught her checking the position of the sun before they'd even broken camp, working out direction the way someone does who has learned the hard way never to be lost in a country that doesn't forgive lost. He said nothing about it either. By mid-morning, the silence had worn thin enough for words to slip through the cracks. Your shoulder, she said. Not really a question. Old, he said. Fine. Old is not fine. Old is old longer. He almost smiled. Didn't quite let himself. You a doctor? No. A pause, weighing how much to give him. I know herbs. My grandmother taught me. Before the boat. The boat. From Guangdong. She said the word like a door she was opening only a crack. Bad year there. Flood, then no rice. My family owed money to stay alive. I am how they paid some of it back. Silas said nothing for a stretch, letting the road eat the silence, and then, that's a hell of a thing to carry. Everyone carries something, she said. Flat. Final. Closing the door again gently, but closing it all the same. Your shoulder. What happened? Because that's how it worked between them already, she was learning. You didn't get to ask without also being asked. Fair trade. Cold trade. But fair fell, he said, which was true and also nowhere near the whole truth, and they both understood that without either one saying so. Fell, she repeated, testing the shape of the lie in her mouth, deciding to let it stand for now. There would be time, or there wouldn't. Either way, pushing wouldn't help today. You are a bad liar, she added anyway, unable to resist it. For a man who says so little, you would think the little you say would at least be true. Didn't say I was good at it. Said it was fine. Fine again. That word. You got a better one? Many, she said. Convenient. Comfortable. Cowardly some days if a man wants to be honest about his own silences. That's 3 words. You asked for better. I gave you options. He glanced back at her, something wry tugging at the corner of his mouth. You always talk this much once a person lets you start? You have known me 4 days, Leon said. I have been very quiet those 4 days. Out of respect. You should be grateful I am pacing myself. That's pacing yourself? You have not seen me, not pace myself, she said. Ride faster if you are frightened. He didn't ride faster. But something in his shoulders had eased another notch, and the road ahead, for the first time since Redstone Flats, felt less like a distance to be endured and more like a distance the two of them were simply quietly crossing together. They rode on. That evening, making camp again, she found the small knife she carried and used it to strip bark from a scrub oak, working the wood between her fingers into something like a poultice. And when he asked what it was for, she said, simply, your shoulder, and did not ask permission, only walked over and started unwrapping the bandana he'd tied loose around it that morning. He let her, which surprised him more than it surprised her. Her hands were quick and sure and entirely without hesitation, the hands of someone who had done this exact motion 100 times before, in a different country for different people, and there was something in the economy of her movements that told him more about her than 3 days of conversation could have. Where, he asked, watching the fire rather than her face, easier that way. Did you learn to do that so fast? My grandmother, she said again. She died before the flood took the rice. Lucky, maybe. She did not have to see what came after. You did. I did. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The poultice went on. The bandana went back over it. She sat down across the fire, a little closer than the night before, though neither of them remarked on that either. Thank you, Silas said. 2 words. He didn't offer many more than that most days, but these 2 he meant all the way through. You bought silence, Leon said, and there. Finally, something almost like humor flickered at the corner of her mouth, quick as a struck match. I give you good silence. Fair trade. He looked at her then. Really looked. And something in his chest, some muscle that had gone stiff and unused for 4 years, moved for the first time. He didn't call it anything. Wasn't ready to. But it moved. The second full day of riding turned mean around mid-morning, the way desert weather does, no warning in it at all. Just a wall of wind rising up out of nowhere and dragging a churning brown curtain of dust behind it. Silas saw it coming before she did. Called out sharp off the road. Now, and she didn't argue, didn't ask why, just followed him down into a shallow gully where a stand of palaverd offered what little shelter the land had to give. The dust devil hit hard enough to spook both horses. Silas's gelding reared, hooves striking air, and he fought it down with the particular calm of a man who'd done this 100 times before. Leon's borrowed mare, though, had less patience for it, less trust in the stranger holding her lead, and she bolted sideways out of the gully entirely, dragging Lion half off the saddle before she got a proper grip again. Let go the reins if she keeps pulling, Silas shouted, already moving his own horse to cut the mare off before she reached open ground. I am not letting go of anything, Leon shouted back, teeth gritted, both hands white-knuckled on the leather, more stubborn than sensible in that particular moment. This is my horse for now. She does not get to decide that alone. Which was, Silas would think later, a very Leon thing to say in the middle of a dust storm, arguing philosophy with a panicked animal instead of simply doing the safer thing. Between the two of them, his horse blocking, her stubborn grip holding, they got the mare, turned and settled back into the gully just as the worst of the wind tore past overhead. And for a long minute afterward, they sat their horses close together, breathing hard, dust settling slow in their hair and eyelashes, saying nothing. Then Leon laughed. Short surprise, half a cough from the dust still in her throat, but a real laugh, the first one he'd heard out of her. Your face, she managed, pointing at him, when she pulled me sideways. You looked like a man watching his own coffee spill. That bad? Worse, she said. Coffee, at least, you would not have chased across open ground. He almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth doing the same small, reluctant thing it had done over the poultice the night before. And something easy passed between them in that gully. Something that had nothing to do with rescue or debt or grief. Just 2 people who had solved a small, stupid, dangerous problem together and come out the other side of it laughing. They made camp early that evening, dust still settling out of the sky in a fine, gritty haze, and neither one of them mentioned how much closer their bedrolls sat that night than the 10 careful feet from before. Not close, just closer. The kind of distance 2 people leave between themselves when trust has started, quietly, without either one deciding it on purpose, to grow. They reached the outskirts of Iron Hollow on the 3rd afternoon, and it was there, going through his saddlebag for the receipt Kane had shoved into his hand. Back in Redstone Flats, the paper that made the whole transaction legal, made her free instead of stolen, made him a man who'd bought a debt instead of a man on the wrong side of a rope himself, that Silas frowned. Frowned and stopped his horse, and read it again. Liane noticed. She noticed everything. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, which was the second lie he'd told her, and the second time she let it stand without pushing. But it wasn't nothing. The paper claimed her family's debt had been transferred through 3 separate hands before landing with Cain, each transfer signed and dated, each one supposedly legal as church on Sunday, except the ink on the earliest signature was too fresh, except the date on the middle transfer came 6 weeks after the date on the one that was supposed to follow it, except the amount, written out twice on the page the way such papers required, didn't match between the two writings. Off by enough to notice, not enough to be an honest slip of the pen, which meant somebody had built this paper backward, written the ending first, and worked their way toward a beginning that would hold up to a glance and fall apart under anything closer. Silas had spent enough years reading brand transfers and grazing leases to know a forged document when one sat folded in his own hand. He'd bought a debt that, as far as the law of the territory was concerned, might not exist at all, which meant the woman riding beside him wasn't legally owned by anyone. Had never been. Someone Cain, or somebody standing behind Cain, somebody with deeper pockets and a longer reach had built a lie tall enough to sell a person and short enough that nobody looking to buy her freedom would think to check the foundation. And if that was true, then legally speaking, Silas Merrick hadn't bought anyone's freedom at all. He'd bought a fiction. And fictions, in a territory this lawless, this far from any judge who'd bother to look twice, had a way of getting men killed for the trouble of exposing them, because that was the part his mind kept snagging on, over and over, the whole rest of that ride. Not the forgery itself. Men forged papers all over this territory, over cattle brands and mining claims and grazing lines, and mostly nobody died over it. Mostly it just meant lawyers and long waiting and a slow grinding kind of injustice that wore a man down instead of killing him outright. Except this wasn't cattle. This was a person, which meant somebody, somewhere, had decided a human being was worth building a careful, patient lie around. And a lie that careful, that patient, didn't come cheap. It came from a man with time to spend and reason to spend it. So who profits from a lie this size? Who has 3 signatures worth forging and the patience to age the ink just enough to pass a careless glance? Not Cain. Cain was greedy, but he wasn't clever. Not clever like this, not 3 signatures deep clever. Cain was the mouth this lie spoke through. Somebody else had written the words. Silas didn't have a name yet, wouldn't, not for weeks. But he had the shape of one, the outline of a man standing behind a curtain, patient and careful and willing to spend real money making a lie look older than it was. And that shape alone was enough to put a cold weight in his chest that hadn't been there an hour ago. He folded the paper back along its worn crease and slid it into the saddlebag and said nothing. Not yet. Turning the problem over in the quiet way he turned over every problem, slow, patient, looking for the load-bearing wall before he decided which direction to push. Leanne watched him do it. Watched the frown settle into something more permanent behind his eyes. "You are thinking too loud," she said. "I can hear it from here." "Just tired," he said. The third lie. She let that one stand too, for now filing it next to the others, building her own quiet ledger of the things this man chose not to say. That night, making the last camp before the ranch, he almost told her. Got as far as opening his mouth around it. The shape of the words already forming "there's a problem with the paper" might mean something for both of us, before some old, stubborn instinct closed his jaw back around them. Because what good would it do her tonight, worn thin from 3 days of riding, to learn that the freedom he'd handed her in that street might not hold up to a lawyer's eye, that the whole shaky architecture of her safety might rest on a lie somebody else had built, patient and careful, for reasons neither of them yet understood. Except silence had a cost too. He was starting slowly to understand that. Every unspoken thing sat in a house eventually, took up a chair at the table, whether you named it or not. He said nothing. Told himself it was mercy. Suspected, somewhere underneath the telling, that it might just be cowardice wearing Mercy's coat. They rode on toward the ranch as the light went gold and then rust-colored, and somewhere behind them, back in Redstone Flats, a man named Garrett Thorne was sitting in a room above the very saloon where the auction had been held, reading a telegram and smiling in a way that had nothing warm in it at all. But neither Silas nor Leon knew that yet. That was a storm still gathering, out past the edge of what either of them could see. For now there was only the road, and the low gold hills, and the ranch waiting somewhere ahead of them called Iron Hollow. The ranch sat in a shallow bowl of land, a weathered timber house with a wide porch worn silver by sun, a barn leaning very slightly with the particular dignity of something old that has decided not to fall down out of stubbornness alone, and beyond it, a scatter of outbuildings and a corral where a handful of horses stood watching the new arrivals with mild, unhurried interest. 3 men came out from the barn as they rode up. Whit Doyle first, the foreman, a broad, sun-cracked man somewhere past 50, who had worked this land longer than Silas had owned it, and had a way of saying nothing that somehow communicated everything. Behind him, 2 younger hands, one lanky and eager-eyed, the other, a man named Amos Pratt, wearing an expression that soured the moment it landed on Leon, and did not sweeten again, boss, Whit said, by way of greeting, eyes moving from Silas to Leon and back again, waiting. Silas swung down, helped Lion down, though she was already halfway to doing it herself, and something about the offered hand, however unnecessary, made Amos Pratt's mouth twist a little further. "This is Leon Joe," Silas said. No explanation beyond the name. He didn't know anyone won, and his tone made that plain enough that nobody asked for it. He turned then, facing all 3 men, and something in his stance shifted squared, deliberate, a man laying a foundation he intended to hold. "She is not property," he said. Flat. Final. The same tone he'd used bidding in the street, the tone that didn't rise and didn't need to. "She works if she wants. She leaves if she wants. Anyone touches her without her say-so answers to me. That's not a rule. That's the only rule that matters on this land, and it doesn't bend." Silence settled over the yard. A horse stamped somewhere in the corral. Whit's face didn't change much, but something in his eyes did. Something like the particular respect a man gives another man for saying a hard thing plainly instead of dressing it up. Amos Pratt's jaw worked like he had something to say and had just enough sense left not to say it. Not yet. Leon stood very still through all of it, watching the men watch her, cataloging which ones looked away first and which ones held her gaze and what that told her about each of them. It was a skill she'd had to learn fast, on the boat, in the months after. Reading a room before the room decided what to do with you. "Ma'am," Whit said finally, tipping his hat, an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to surprise even him as it left his mouth. "Whit Doyle. I run things day-to-day round here. You need anything, you ask me straight." "Thank you," Leon said. Her English came slow, careful, each word placed like a stone she'd checked for solid footing before putting weight on it. "I will remember that." She would. She remembered everything. The lanky young hand stepped forward next, hat already off, grinning the wide, unguarded grin of somebody too young yet to have learned suspicion as a habit. "Cole Ashby, ma'am. Pleased to meet you. Boss doesn't say much most days, so I figure somebody around here ought to." "Cole," Whit said, in the particular tone of a man who has said a name like a warning many times before. "What?" "I'm being neighborly." "You're being nosy. There's a difference, same as I just told Amos." Cole grinned wider, entirely unbothered, and Leon found herself, despite everything, despite the crate and the rope and the long dry road behind her, fighting down something that felt dangerously close to a smile. "You are the one who does not stop talking," she said to him. Not unkind. Simply accurate. Everybody says that. Cole scratched at the back of his neck, delighted rather than embarrassed. "Ma'am, I gotta say, most folks the boss brings home don't sass a man inside the first 10 seconds of meeting him. I like it. Good sign." Cole, Whit, again. Longer this time, more warning packed into the single syllable. I'm going." He backed off toward the barn, still grinning, throwing one last look over his shoulder. "Welcome to Iron Hollow, ma'am. Ain't much, but it's honest ground." Amos said nothing at all, which, in its own sour way, said everything that needed saying. The house had a kitchen that had clearly not been cooked in with any real intention since a woman last stood in it. 4 years of a man's rough, functional meals, leaving their mark, in the layout, in the dust on shelves that hadn't been reached in a while, in the particular emptiness of a room built for 2 hands and used, for a long time now, by one. Leon stood in the doorway of it that first evening and felt something complicated move through her chest. Not quite grief, not quite recognition. Something in between, the specific ache of walking into a space shaped like loss. She did not ask whose kitchen this had been. She didn't need to. The absence answered for itself. "You don't have to," Silas said from behind her, awkward in a way that didn't suit him, watching her take in the room. "Cook, I mean. Wasn't part of any deal, there wasn't a deal." "I want to," she said. Simple, true. I am tired of being cooked for by no one. I am tired of eating what I am given. I will cook because I choose it. Not because you bought silence and now you think you bought supper too. That landed somewhere between an accusation and a joke, and for a moment Silas didn't know which side to stand on. And then the corner of his mouth did something it hadn't done in longer than he wanted to count, and he said, "Fair enough," and stepped back and let her have the room. She found what there was: dried beans, a slab of salt pork gone tough with age, flour going pale with weevil if she didn't watch it, a scatter of dried chiles someone had grown once and forgotten about, and she went to work with the particular ferocity of someone reclaiming a piece of herself that had been taken away and only just handed back. Ginger she didn't have, star anise she didn't have. What she had was memory, and hands that knew how to make memory into food, even when half the ingredients were missing, substituting where she had to, refusing to let the dish become less than it should be simply because Arizona wasn't Guangdong. The smell that filled the house that evening was unlike anything that kitchen had produced in years. Whit noticed it from clear across the yard and found an excuse to be near the porch around supper time. Amos Pratt noticed it too and pretended not to, and showed up anyway, hunger apparently louder in him than resentment. At the table, long, rough-hewn, built for a crew twice this size, 5 plates went out. Silas at the head, though he didn't sit there like a king, more like a man who simply hadn't rearranged the furniture since he'd been the only one using it. Whit beside him, the lanky young hand, whose name turned out to be Cole Ashby, practically vibrating with the effort of not diving straight into the food. Amos Pratt across from him, arms crossed, waiting to find fault. And Leanne standing at first, not sitting, until Silas caught her eye and nodded at the empty chair like it wasn't a question. And she sat. The first bites went around the table, in a silence that had nothing wary left in it. Whit set his fork down halfway through and looked at his plate like it had personally wronged him. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I have eaten cookcheck beans on this ranch for 11 years, and I would like to formally apologize to every previous meal I have ever called good." Cole laughed around a mouthful, nearly choked, kept eating anyway. Even Amos, grudging, wordless, went back for seconds, which said more than any compliment could have. "What is this?" Cole asked, pointing his fork at the reddish sauce pooled beside the meat. "And can I have it every day for the rest of my natural life?" "Chili and something else," Leon said. "You would not have the second thing here. I used what your land gave me instead. Close enough, maybe, if you have never tasted the real one." "Ma'am, this is the real one. I don't care what you say. This is the realest thing that's ever happened to me at this table. You are very easy to please by good cooking, yes." Cole pointed his fork at Whit now. "Whit's beans, by comparison, are a punishment. A crime, even. I've been meaning to say something for years and never had the nerve." "My beans," Whit said, with great dignity, "have kept this crew alive through 2 bad winters." "They kept us alive," Cole agreed. "Barely. Grudgingly. Like they resented doing it." Even Silas huffed something that might, in a more talkative man, have counted as a laugh, and Lyon caught it, filed it away next to the coffee laugh from 3 days back, already beginning, without quite meaning to, the private work of collecting every small crack in his stillness like a woman gathering coins. Silas said nothing more. Just ate, slow, and something in his shoulders, the same shoulders that had carried 4 years of a house, too quiet, loosened by a fraction that only Leon, watching everything the way she always watched everything, seemed to notice. Later, after the plates were cleared and the men had drifted out to the porch to smoke and talk low about cattle and weather, Leon found herself alone in the small room off the kitchen that Silas had said, awkward, almost apologetic, was hers now, for as long as she wanted it. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window facing east, toward hills she didn't know the names of yet, toward a horizon that had nothing familiar sitting on it anywhere. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally, let her shoulders come down from where they'd been sitting, tight and high since the crate, since before the crate if she was honest, since the boat, since the docks, since don't start counting. If you start counting you will not stop, and there is no room in you tonight for all of it at once. She opened her hand. The small paper packet the old woman had pressed into it sat there still, a little crushed now from a day of riding, and she unfolded it carefully, the tea leaves inside dry and dark and smelling faintly of somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with rain that came on time. Somewhere with a mother's hands that knew exactly how to braid hair too fast and too tight because there was never enough morning to do it slow. Somewhere that didn't exist anymore. Not really. Not the way she remembered it. Because memory has a way of repainting a house brighter than it ever actually stood. She pressed the packet closed again. Set it on the small shelf above the washstand. The first thing she owned in this room, the first thing that was entirely only hers. Because that was new too. A room with a door with a latch on the inside. Nobody's hand on her arm deciding where she slept or whether she slept at all. Except new didn't mean safe yet. Except a latch was only as good as the man on the other side of it choosing not to test it. Except she had believed, once before, that a room was safe and been wrong and stop. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes, same as she had by the fire on the trail, and breathed until the shaking passed, and reminded herself, the way she reminded herself most nights, that fear checked and found wanting was just weather. It passed through. It did not have to be let in and given a chair. Silas Merrick had raised his hand in a dusty street and not lowered it. He had left his pistol within her reach on the trail instead of pointed at her. He had said to three strange men in his own yard that she was not property and meant it plainly enough that even Amos Pratt hadn't dared argue out loud. It wasn't proof. Nothing yet was proof. But it was more than she'd had in 3 years. And tonight, in a narrow bed in a room with a working latch, that would have to be enough. She slept, eventually, deeper than she expected to, and did not dream of the boat at all. She woke before anyone else, old habit from years of needing to be useful before anyone had cause to question whether she deserved her place, and found the kitchen still dark, the whole ranch quiet in that particular hour, before the sun properly commits to rising. She lit the stove herself, unfamiliar with its exact temperament yet, coaxing a fire out of it the way she'd coax any stubborn thing, patient and firm at once, and had coffee, real coffee, her way, not his going. By time Silas came through the door, still tucking in his shirt, visibly startled to find the kitchen already occupied and already smelling like something worth waking up for. You didn't have to. He started and stopped himself before finishing it, recognizing, a beat too late, the exact shape of the sentence she'd already corrected him on once. I know, Leanne said, not even looking up from the stove, satisfaction plain in her voice at having caught him almost repeating himself. You are learning. Slowly, but learning. Slowly's still learning. I did not say it was not. She poured him a cup, watched him take the first sip with the wariness of a man bracing for dirt and, finding instead something worth savoring. His eyebrows rose, involuntary, and she felt a small, private satisfaction at the sight of it. Better, better, he admitted. Say it like you mean it. I mean it, he said, and there was something almost helpless in the honesty of it. A man discovering, one small domestic victory, at a time, that he had let someone new all the way into the quiet architecture of his mornings, without quite deciding to. They drank the coffee together in a silence that had nothing strained left in it, watching the sun finally clear the eastern hills and spill gold across the yard, across the corral, across a whole unclaimed day. Neither of them yet knew what to do with, exactly, beyond simply being grateful it had arrived at all. Later that morning, once the coffee had done its work and the ranch had properly woken around them, Silas saddled 2 horses without being asked and found Leanne on the porch, watching the hands already moving about their chores. Come on, he said. Show you the place properly. Man buys, he stopped, caught the word before it fully left his mouth, tried again. A man brings somebody home, seems only fair she knows the ground she's standing on. They rode the boundary of Iron Hollow, slow through the late morning, Silas naming things as they passed the way he'd named them on the trail this ridge, that spring. The old line shack his father had built, with his own hands 3 decades back. The particular bend in the creek where the water ran cold and clear, even in the driest part of summer. It is beautiful, Leanne said, and meant it, taking in the wide gold sweep of grassland running up against the darker hills beyond, the sky arching so much bigger out here than anything she'd known in crowded Guangdong in the crowded months after. Lonely, maybe, but beautiful. Was lonelier a week ago, Silas said, before he'd quite decided to say it out loud, and then looked faintly startled at his own honesty, the way he often did lately, like a man surprised to find his own mouth had gotten ahead of his usual caution. Leon let that sit a moment, not pushing it further, simply accepting the small gift of it the way she'd learned to accept most things from him, quiet, without fuss, careful not to spook something still learning to trust its own footing. Show me the spring, she said instead. The one with the cold water. I want to see if Arizona can make a promise it actually keeps. It could, and did, and they sat by it a while in comfortable silence, boots off, feet in water cold enough to make her gasp and laugh both at once. And for a stretch of that morning, neither forgery nor fire nor any trouble waiting out past the horizon felt quite real at all. Just the water and the sky, and two people slowly, carefully, learning the shape of a shared life neither one had expected to find. On the ride back, boots still damp, Leon broke the easy quiet with a question that had clearly been sitting in her a while, waiting for the right moment to surface. I want to understand the shape of this arrangement, she said. Matter of fact, the particular directness she brought to anything that mattered. Not the debt. The debt is finished, whatever the paper says or does not say. I mean the shape of my days here. What is expected? What is not? Didn't figure I'd expected much of anything, Silas said, a little caught off guard by the bluntness of it. Told you that in the street. You told me I was free. You did not tell me what free looks like on a working ranch with 5 other people in it. Freedom without shape is just a nicer kind of confusion. She counted it out on her fingers, the way she seemed to count most important things. I will cook, because I have decided I want to. I will not be asked to cook. There is a difference. I will help where I choose to help the branding, the mending, whatever else needs doing, and I expect to be paid the same as any hand would be paid for the same hours, not fed and housed as though gratitude were a wage. Silas considered that, turning it over with the same care he turned over everything, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had no argument against a single word of it. Fair, he said, more than fair. I should have offered wages myself first thing, instead of making you ask. You should have, she agreed, without malice, simply stating the fact of it. You are learning. I keep saying this. Eventually it will stop being a compliment and start being an expectation. I'll try to earn the expectation then. See that you do. But there was warmth all through the words, and by the time they rode back into the yard, something had settled between them that felt less like a bargain, and more like the first honest terms of a partnership neither one had quite dared name yet. Whit's hands, she'd already clocked. The way he favored his right one, a stiffness in 2 fingers that made gripping rope a slower business than it should have been for a man his size. After supper, while the others drifted out to the porch, she caught him alone by the wash basin and, without asking permission, took his hand and turned it palm up toward the lamplight. Old break, she said. Not set right. Fell off a green horse a few winters back, Whit admitted, more startled by her directness than offended by it. Doc in town wanted $4. I didn't have to set it proper. Made do. I can help. Not fix. Help. She was already moving toward the small bundle of dried herbs she'd carried the whole way from Redstone Flats tucked inside her sleeve, the one thing besides the knife she hadn't let out of her keeping. It will hurt before it helps. I tell you honest now so you don't call me a liar later. Whit huffed something that might have been a laugh. Ma'am, at my age, honest hurt is a luxury. Go on. She worked a poultice into the joints of his fingers, binding it with a strip of cloth, murmuring instructions about how long to leave it, when to change it, what movements to avoid, and Whit sat there, letting a stranger handle his hand with the particular trust of a man who'd learned, over 11 hard years on this land, to recognize competence when it was standing right in front of him. You did this before, he said. Not a question. Many times. Village didn't have money for real doctor either. A pause, something flickering behind her eyes. I got good at making do too. Whit looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his weathered face. Well, he said finally, making do just got a lot better around here. It was Amos Pratt who broke the fragile peace, 2 days later, out by the corral, when he thought no one who mattered was close enough to hear. Leanne was hauling water, arms when he stepped into her path, close, closer than the distance called for, a smell of stale whiskey riding under his words. Bet you're real good at making a man comfortable, he said, low, ugly, the kind of voice that had learned exactly how quiet it needed to be to avoid consequences. That what you did back where you came from? Before the boss went and played hero. Something cold moved through Leon's chest, old and familiar, the specific violence of being looked at like an object, with no say in its own handling. She set the water bucket down. Move, she said, even. Flat. Or what? Or you find out. A new voice. Silas. Come around the corner of the barn at exactly the wrong moment for Amos, and exactly the right moment for everyone else. His own voice gone very quiet in the way that, by now, everyone on that ranch had learned to fear more than shouting. He didn't raise his hands. Didn't need to. Just stood there, still, immovable, that same look he'd worn in the crowd at Redstone Flats settling over his face. The look that had made a heckler go silent without a single blow thrown Amos's nerve, thin to begin with, evaporated entirely. He muttered something that wasn't quite an apology, and wasn't quite defiance, and stalked off toward the bunkhouse house, and Silas watched him go with an expression that promised this was not, in fact, finished, just postponed. Then he turned to Leanne, something almost like an apology forming behind his eyes. She held up a hand before he could offer it. "I do not need you to speak for me," she said, steady. "Sure." Something fierce, burning quiet behind the words. "I told him to move. I meant it. I do not need saving, Silas Merrick. I have been saving myself a long time before you raised your hand in that street." He looked at her, something recalibrating behind his eyes, some assumption quietly folding itself up and being put away. "Noted," he said, and meant it. She picked the water bucket back up, and this time, when she walked past him toward the house, there was something new in the set of her shoulders. Not gratitude for a rescue she hadn't asked for. Something closer to respect, offered and received in the same wordless breath. He had come. He hadn't needed to fight. He'd simply stood there and let his stillness do what other men needed fists for. That, she thought, walking back toward the kitchen with the last of the daylight going copper over the hills, was a kind of strength she hadn't expected to find out here, in this dry, strange, unforgiving country. Whit found Amos out by the bunkhouse a while later, sitting alone on an overturned water trough, jaw still tight, staring at nothing. "You're a damn fool," Whit said, without much heat in it, sitting down heavy beside him. "Not for what you feel. Man's allowed to feel whatever fool thing he feels. For what you said out loud. There's a difference, and you're old enough to know it." "Didn't mean nothing by it," Amos muttered, which they both knew wasn't true, and which Whit didn't bother arguing. "Boss won't run you off for one bad afternoon," Whit said instead. "But he's watching now. And so am I. You get one more chance to be the man your mother probably hoped you'd turn into. I'd use it. Was I you?" Amos didn't answer that. Just sat there in the gathering dark, turning something over behind his eyes that looked, for the first time since he'd arrived at Iron Hollow, 3 years back, something close to shame. Whit left him to it. Some lessons he'd learned. A man had to sit with alone a while before they took root. Behind her, Silas stood a moment longer in the yard, watching her go, turning over in his mind the folded, forged paper still sitting in his saddlebag, the debt that legally might not exist, the freedom he'd thought he'd bought her, that maybe, in the eyes of the law, she'd never needed buying at all. He didn't know yet what that meant. Didn't know who had built the lie, or why or how far the roots of it ran back toward Redstone Flats and the man who owned half of it. But he knew, standing there in the gathering dark, with the smell of her cooking still drifting from the house, and the sound of Whit's low laughter carrying from the porch, that something in Iron Hollow had shifted. Something that had been quiet and empty for 4 long years had a pulse in it again. He didn't have a name for it yet, because naming a thing made it real, and real things could be taken away, and he had already learned once, at the edge of dark water, exactly how fast the world could take a thing away, once you'd made the mistake of loving it out loud. So he didn't name it. Not that night. Just stood in the yard a while longer, listening to the small sounds of a house with 2 people in it again, a pot set down, a low laugh from the porch, the particular music of a home that had stopped, for the first time in 4 years, holding its breath. But he suspected, watching the lamplight come on in the kitchen window, that he was going to need a name for it soon. Somewhere out past the hills, in a lit room above a saloon, Garrett Thorne folded a telegram of his own and smiled the smile of a man who believed, with the particular arrogance of men who have never truly lost anything, that the story was still entirely his to write. He was wrong about that, but it would take the rest of this long, dry summer to prove it to him. 3 weeks changes a place. Not the land. The land doesn't care about weeks, but the people on it. That changes fast if you let it. Iron Hollow had gone from a house with 1 voice in it to a house with 2. And the second voice had opinions. Strong ones. Especially about coffee. "This is not coffee," Leanne said one morning, holding the tin cup out at arm's length like it had personally offended her ancestors. "This is dirt. Someone told you dirt was coffee and you believed them. And now you make dirt every day like it's a good decision." Silas, halfway through his own cup, paused. "It's fine. It is not fine. Fine is a word people use when they are too polite to say bad. You're not polite. No, she agreed, not even a little sorry about it. I am honest. Different thing. And there it was, the sound that hadn't come out of him in 4 years. Low and rusty at first, like a hinge that hadn't been used, then fuller, a real laugh, surprising him as much as it surprised her, surprising him enough that he set the cup down like it might spill from the shaking. Leon stared at him. Something crossed her face too fast to name pleasure, maybe, or something closer to relief, like she'd been testing a bridge she wasn't sure would hold her weight, and it had held. That is a good sound, she said, quieter now. You should let it out more. Been a while, he admitted, which, for Silas Merrick, was practically a confession dragged out under torture. I noticed. She took his cup, dumped the coffee out the door where it hissed faintly against dry ground, and started making a new pot her way. Sit. I fixed this. Both things. Coffee first. He sat and watched her work and thought, not for the first time in 3 weeks, that his kitchen had never smelled this good, and neither, come to think of it, had his mornings, because that was the shape the weeks had taken. Small thing. Language traded back and forth like coins across a counter. She taught him a handful of words in her own tongue. He butchered every one of them, and she laughed at the butchering. And in exchange he taught her the names of things on the land: mesquite, saguaro, arroyo, words she rolled around in her mouth like she was testing their weight before deciding whether to keep them, which meant the silence between them had started to fill up with something other than grief and caution. Not trust, exactly. Not yet. But the beginning shape of it, the outline before the color goes in. Until the day the wagon came up from Redstone Flats and reminded them both that the rest of the world hadn't forgotten they existed. Branding fell in the second week, and Leon, uninvited but undeterred, showed up at the pens at first light anyway. Sleeves rolled, hair braided tight and out of the way. You don't have to, Silas said. Same words he'd used about the kitchen, already knowing, from the particular set of her jaw, exactly how little those words would accomplish. I know I do not have to, she said. I am here because the fire needs tending, and someone needs to keep water moving to the men working. And I have 2 working hands, same as everyone else on this land. Put me somewhere useful or step out of my way. He put her at the branding fire, which turned out to be its own kind of education for both of them. She'd never smelled anything quite like scorched hide before, and said so, plainly, the first time the iron touched hide and the calf bawled, and the whole pen filled with smoke and noise. This is a terrible smell, she announced, to nobody in particular, fanning a hand in front of her face. How does anyone get used to this? You don't exactly, Whit called from across the pen, wrestling a calf into position. You just get better at holding your breath. That is not the same as getting used to it. No, ma'am. It surely is not. By midday she'd worked out a rhythm with coal, passing irons, calling out which brand went where, and somewhere in the noise and the dust and the particular chaos of 40 head of cattle being worked in a single morning, Silas caught himself watching her, instead of the herd more than once, caught himself smiling at nothing in particular, and had to remind himself twice that he was supposed to be counting calves. Boss, Cole said at one point, sidling up beside him during a lull, grinning in the specific way that meant trouble. You're doing that thing again. What thing? That thing where you stop working to watch her work. Whit and me got a bet going on how long it takes you to say something about it out loud. There's nothing to say. Sure, boss. Cole's grin widened. Sure there ain't. Silas didn't dignify that with an answer, went back to counting calves with a discipline that felt even to him a little forced, and did not look over at Leon again for at least a quarter hour, which he considered privately a significant act of willpower. Some evenings, when the work was done and the crew had scattered to the bunkhouse, Silas and Leon sat at the kitchen table, with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper between them, trading words back and forth like 2 people building a small private bridge, 1 plank at a time. Ma, Leon said, tapping the paper. Horse. Ma, Silas repeated badly, the tone flattening out entirely wrong, and Leon winced with theatrical suffering. No, Ma. Like this. She said it again, the tone rising and falling in a way his ears simply refused to catch. You are saying it like a man asking a question he does not care about the answer to. That's not what I'm doing. That is exactly what you are doing. Try again. He tried again. Got it slightly less wrong, which she accepted with the weary grace of a teacher who has learned to celebrate small victories rather than mourn large failures. Your turn, he said. Say arroyo. Arroyo. Leon tried, and he shook his head. Arroyo. More roll on the R. Arroyo! She rolled it so hard it turned into something closer to a growl, and Silas laughed, the real laugh now, easy and unguarded, and Leanne pointed at him in mock accusation. You are laughing. That is not helpful teaching. You made a very fierce word out of a dry creek bed. Your language makes no sense. Why does a dry creek need so many rolling letters? In my language, a river simply sounds like a river. Never claimed English made sense. No, she agreed. You did not. That is, I think, the most honest thing you have said to me since we met. They kept at it a while longer. Words traded back and forth. Mistakes laughed over rather than corrected too sharply. And somewhere in the small, patient work of teaching each other how to say horse and creek and hills, in a language the other hadn't been born into, something quieter and larger built itself between them two, unremarked upon, unnamed, but steadily, unmistakably growing. That evening, both of them sore and smelling of smoke and cattle, they sat on the porch steps eating a supper too tired to properly taste, and Lyanne leaned her head back against the post and closed her eyes. Your ranch is trying to kill me, she said, slowly. With cattle. You volunteered. I did. I regret nothing. I'm simply informing you of the attempt. He almost laughed. The sound came out anyway, low and unplanned, and she cracked one eye open to look at him, satisfied like a woman who had gotten exactly the reaction she'd been fishing for. There it is again, she said. That good sound. I am collecting them. I will have enough for a whole song by autumn at this rate. That's so. It is so. Keep making them. I like my collection growing. Cole Ashby drove the supply wagon into town twice a month, and he came back that particular Tuesday with less than he'd left for and a face gone tight and pale under his sunburn. Kane wouldn't sell me the full order, he said, unloading half-empty crates onto the porch while Silas watched, jaw setting hard, said his suppliers run short. Except I saw the flour sacks stacked clear to the rafters through the window. Full as Christmas. He say why. Cole hesitated, glanced toward the kitchen window, where Leon's shadow moved behind the glass and dropped his voice. Didn't have to, boss. Man behind me in line made a comment. About who Iron Hollow's been keeping company with lately. Kane just smiled. Didn't argue it. Silas didn't say anything for a long moment. Just stood there in the yard, with the half-empty crates at his feet. Something cold and familiar settling into his chest. The specific weight of watching a decent thing get punished simply for being decent. We'll manage, he said finally. There's a trading post 2 days north. Slower. But their money's as good as ours out there. That's a 4-day round trip, boss. Middle of branding season. I know what it is, Cole. He knew exactly what it was. It was the town telling him, in the quiet, deniable language small towns use, that his choice had a price, and they intended to keep charging it. He didn't tell Leon. Not that first day. Told himself it was because there was no point worrying her over something he'd already solved. Except that wasn't the whole truth, and some stubborn, honest corner of him knew it. The whole truth was closer to this. He didn't want to watch her face do what it would do when she found out that her presence on this land was costing the people around her something real. She'd spent her whole life, near as he could tell, being made to feel like a burden. He wasn't about to hand her fresh proof of it if he could help it. Which was, he'd learn soon enough, its own kind of mistake. The kind you make out of care and pay for out of trust. She found out anyway. Of course she did. She noticed everything, and a man suddenly riding north for flour instead of 1 hour into town wasn't the kind of thing that stayed hidden in a house with 2 people in it. You did not tell me, she said. Flat. Not quite angry. Something more tired than angry. Something that had clearly worn this particular groove before, in other places, with other people who thought protecting her meant deciding for her. Didn't want you carrying it. I already carry it, she said. I have carried it my whole life. You do not get to decide which weight I am strong enough for, Silas Merrick. That is not kindness. That is just a different kind of taking. The words landed harder than she probably meant them to, or maybe exactly as hard as she meant them to, and he stood there in the kitchen doorway turning them over, recognizing the shape of the lesson even as it stung. You're right, he said. Simple. No excuse trailing behind it. Won't happen again. She studied him for a long beat, checking, the way she checked everything. For the scene where a promise like that usually came apart, she didn't find one. Not that day. Good, she said, and went back to the stove, and something in the set of her shoulders eased half an inch, the particular relief of being told the truth by someone who could have kept lying and chose not to. He rode into town himself the next morning, alone. telling nobody where he was headed, because some conversations a man needed to have, without an audience deciding afterward how brave or how foolish he'd been. Kane was behind his own counter when Silas walked in, and something in the saloon keeper's face flickered, quick, before settling back into practiced blandness. Merrick. Didn't expect you back so soon. Imagine you didn't. Silas set both hands flat on the counter, unhurried, the particular stillness that had made a crowd go quiet in this exact street not 2 months back. Flour, coffee, the usual order. Full order, Kane. Not the half measure you handed my man last week. Supplier's been short. Your shelves were full when Cole came through. Both of us know it. So let's skip the part where you lie to my face and get straight to the part where you tell me what this is actually about. Kane's jaw worked for a moment, weighing something, and then, apparently deciding honesty came less than continued pretense, he leaned forward across the counter and dropped his voice. It's not personal, Merrick. Business is business. Man's got opinions about who I extend credit to, and that man's opinions carry more weight around here than yours do these days. You want to know whose opinions, you already know whose. Thorne. Kane didn't confirm it out loud. Didn't need to. The silence did the confirming for him. You're a grown man, Kane, Silas said. Not a hired hand. You don't have to let another man's fear run your own store. Easy for you to say. You've got a ranch and a reputation for not backing down. I've got a saloon and a mortgage on it that Thorne's bank happens to hold. Kane spread his hands, something almost apologetic in the gesture, though not nearly apologetic enough to change his answer. I'll sell you what I can sell you quiet. Won't put it on the books loud. That's the best I've got, Merrick, and it's better than nothing. Silas studied him a long moment, weighing the man's fear against the man's cowardice, trying to decide how much of one excused the other, and coming up, in the end, without a clean answer. Quiet's better than nothing, he agreed finally. But it's not the same as decent, Kane. Someday this town's going to have to choose which one it wants to be. I'd start practicing now, was I you. He left with half an order, paid in cash, no receipt, and rode home with the particular tired anger of a man who has just watched an entire town's fear do a stronger man's work for him. The old man came 3 days later, on foot, down the long dry road from the direction of the mining camps. And Whit spotted him first from the corral and called out, and by the time he reached the yard half the ranch had gathered to see who walked that road alone and on purpose. He was small and old in the way that made his age hard to guess, somewhere between 60 and 80, wearing clothes patched so many times the patches had patches, and he stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the house for a long moment before he looked at any of the people in it. Funglian said, and something in her voice cracked open, surprised, careful, like she was afraid saying the name too loud might make him disappear. Old Feng, is it truly you? Word travels to the camps, the old man said, in careful accented English, his eyes finding her face and staying there. But it travels. A woman bought free, instead of bought owned. A rancher who would not lower his hand. His gaze shifted, found Silas, and something passed over his weathered features that was equal parts grief and gratitude. Merrick, he said, you do not remember me. I remember you, Silas said, and his voice had gone low and rough in a way none of the hands had heard before. 4 years is a long time. You've aged, so has grief, Old Feng said. It ages a man same as years do. Maybe faster. The yard had gone very quiet. Whit shifted his weight, sensing a conversation too large for the space it was happening in, and started herding the younger hands back toward the barn. With a look that brooked no argument, Leon stood between the two men, feeling something enormous and unspoken pass over her head like weather, and finally she said, Quiet. Someone please tell me what is happening. Who is this to you? Silas looked at Old Feng. Old Feng looked back, something like permission passing between two men who had both spent 4 years carrying the same weight from opposite ends. Come inside, Silas said. Sit. I'll tell it, all of it. Should have told somebody a long time ago. They sat at the long table, the three of them, coffee going cold and untouched between them, and Silas Merrick told a story he had never once told out loud in 4 years. Not to Whit, not to the hands, not to the 4 walls of his own quiet house. He told it plain. No dressing it up, no softening the parts that still cut. A flash flood, sudden and vicious, roaring down a wash on a summer evening. A laborer from the mining camp, this laborer, the man sitting across the table right now, though younger then, and running for his life, being chased into that wash by riders who worked for a man named Garrett Thorne, chased for no better reason than the particular cruelty of men who enjoy watching other men run. And Callie, his wife, 28 years old, riding the ridge above, close enough to see it happen, close enough that she could have looked away and nobody on this earth would have blamed her for it. She didn't look away. She went in after you, Silas said, looking at Old Feng now, the words coming slow and careful like each one cost something to spend. Got you to the bank, got you breathing. Current took her going back. The kitchen had gone so quiet Lian could hear her own heartbeat. I have carried that 4 years, Old Feng said, voice thick. I have said her name in prayers every single night since, in a language she never spoke, hoping somehow it still reaches wherever she is. A woman I never properly thanked. A woman who died so a stranger could keep breathing. She wouldn't have wanted your thanks, Silas said. She'd have wanted you to keep breathing. That's the whole of it. That's all she ever wanted from anybody. Lian sat very still through all of it, understanding now finally, completely the shape of the man who had raised his hand in that dusty street 3 weeks ago. Not a stranger's sudden kindness. Not charity. A promise, made at the edge of dark water, kept the only way a man like Silas Merrick knew how to keep a promise. By raising his hand and refusing, ever again, to lower it while somebody else was drowning. I am sorry, she said finally, softly, to both of them, for what the water took. And I am sorry it took you 4 years to say her name out loud, to someone who could hold it with you. Silas looked at her, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes, the particular vulnerability of a man who has just handed someone his heaviest thing and is waiting to see if they drop it. She didn't drop it. Thank you, he said. To both of them. To all of it. Old Feng stayed 3 days, resting, eating the meals Leon pressed on him without argument, and on the second evening, while Silas and the hands worked the far pasture, Leon found him sitting alone under the cottonwood by the wash, watching the water run low and slow over the stones. She sat down beside him without asking. He didn't seem to mind. You have been carrying something else, she said after a while. Besides the grief for the woman who saved you. Something older. He was quiet a long moment, and you are observant. That is good, out here. It will serve you. My grandmother used to say the same thing, usually right before scolding me for using it on her. That drew something close to a smile from him, brief, tired around the edges. I had a wife once, too. Before the camps. Before any of this. He gestured vaguely at the dry hills, the whole wide, unfamiliar country around them. She did not survive the crossing. Different water than the wash. Ocean water. I have carried her longer than I carried Callie Merrick's memory, and some days I cannot tell anymore which grief I am standing inside. I am sorry, Lian said softly. That is a great deal of water to carry for one man. It is. He looked at her then, something searching in his weathered face. You are young yet. You have not carried your grief so long that it becomes indistinguishable from the rest of you. Do not let it if you can help it. Grief makes a poor houseguest when it overstays. It starts rearranging the furniture. Is that what happened to Silas before I came? Something like it. Though I think, Old Feng said, watching a hawk turn slow circles above the far ridge, your arrival may have finally asked that particular houseguest to leave, or at least to stop rearranging quite so much. Lian said nothing for a while, turning that over, watching the same slow hawk circle, the same pale sky. I did not come here to fix a stranger's grief, she said finally. I came here because a man raised his hand in a street and I had nowhere else to go. Perhaps, Old Feng said. But sometimes the reasons we arrive somewhere and the reasons we choose to stay are not required to match. You may examine your own heart on that question whenever you are ready. There is no hurry. The land is not going anywhere, and neither, I think, is he. He left it there, wise enough not to push further, and the two of them sat together a while longer under the cottonwood, watching the water and the hawk and the long gold light going soft over Iron Hollow. Two people who had each survived a crossing the other could only partly imagine, finding, for one quiet evening, a particular kind of company that needed no further explaining. Before he left, 3 days after his arrival, Old Feng took Silas aside, out by the corral, and lowered his voice. There is more you should know, he said. About Thorn. About why he wanted that girl silenced on the auction block, instead of simply sold to him quiet, the way he usually does business. He does not want people. Not really. He wants what sits underneath the ground your neighbors stand on, and a scared, silenced workforce with no papers and no voice is easier to work than free men who might talk. That girl's debt paper, I have seen its like before. He has men who write such papers for a living. It would not surprise me if it does not hold up to a lawyer's eye at all. Silas felt something cold settle into place, confirming what he'd already suspected reading that paper by Fearlight 3 weeks back. You know this how? Because I worked his camps once too, Old Fung said. Before the flood, I know what that man builds his fortune on. Watch your water rights, Merrick. That is where his eye will land next, if it has not landed there already. He left the next morning, walking the same long road he'd come by, and Silas stood in the yard a long while after he'd disappeared over the rise, turning the warning over in his mind like a stone he couldn't quite set down. The chance to test that warning came sooner than anyone at Iron Hollow would have liked. Garrett Thorne rode up to the ranch himself, 10 days later, flanked by 2 men who did more looking than talking, and he sat his horse in the yard with the particular ease of a man who has never once doubted his own welcome anywhere he chooses to go. He was younger than Silas expected for a man with his reputation. Handsome, in the way that money makes a certain kind of face look handsome even when the eyes behind it are doing arithmetic instead of feeling anything. He smiled easily. That was, Silas would think later, the most unsettling thing about him. How easily the smile came and how little of it ever reached anywhere real. Merrick, Thorne said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Been meaning to pay a neighborly call. Heard you'd acquired some. Interesting company. State your business, Thorne. Straight to it. I like that. Thorne's eyes drifted toward the house, toward the window where Lion's shadow had gone very still, watching. Word in town is there's some question about the legality of that girl's transfer. Papers not quite holding together the way they ought. Shame that. A man could find himself in real trouble, harboring somebody whose ownership status is, shall we say, unresolved. She's not owned, Silas said. Flat. By anybody. Papers or no papers. That's one interpretation. Thorne's smile didn't waver. Territory law might see it different, depending who's asking the judge and how loud they're asking. But I'm not here to argue law with you, Merrick. I'm here to be neighborly. He leaned forward, slightly in the saddle. I could make that whole paperwork headache disappear. Quietly. Favor between neighbors. What's the favor cost? Small thing. Thorne's gaze drifted, almost lazily, toward the low rise beyond the barn, toward the spring-fed creek that ran through Iron Hollow land and on into the dry valley beyond, the only reliable water for 6 miles in any direction. Easement. Right-of-way for a pipeline, through your east pasture down to my holdings past the flats. Wouldn't cost you but a strip of grazing land you don't much use anyway. There it was. Silas felt the whole shape of it click into place. Everything Old Feng had warned him about arriving right on schedule, dressed up polite and sitting a good horse in his own yard, not Leon. Never really Leon, not for Thorne. She'd been a means, a lever, a legal headache dangled just close enough to Silas Merrick's conscience to see if it could be traded for water rights that would let Thorne control every ranch and mining claim for miles. No, Silas said. Thorne's smile finally slipped, just at the edges, just enough to show what sat underneath it. No, he repeated, like the word tasted unfamiliar in his mouth. That's a mighty short answer to a generous offer. It's the only answer you're getting. Get off my land, Thorne. For a moment something dangerous moved behind Thorne's eyes, quick and cold, gone as fast as it came, tucked back behind the smile like a knife slid back into a boot. Suit yourself, he said, gathering his reins. Paperwork's a fragile thing, though, Merrick. Fires happen. Papers burn. So do barns, come to think of it. Out here where the wind carries a spark faster than any man can outrun it. He touched his hat brim, an insult dressed as courtesy. Give my regards to your guest. He turned his horse and rode out, unhurried, his 2 silent men falling in behind him, and Silas stood in the yard long after the dust of them had settled. Thorne's last words sitting in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it spreading out slow and cold. Fires happen. So do barns. He didn't know yet how soon those words would stop being a threat and start being a promise kept. Whit had watched the whole exchange from the barn door, close enough to hear most of it, and once Thorne's dust had settled on the horizon, he crossed the yard with his jaw set hard. That man doesn't make threats he doesn't mean. Boss. I've watched him work this valley 11 years. Every ranch that's crossed him has lost something within the month. A fence. A well. Once, old Hutchins' whole south pasture burned black 2 nights after he refused a grazing lease. I know his kind, Whit. Then you know we ought to double up on night watches. Starting tonight. Wit's eyes were hard, protective in a way that had nothing sentimental left in it. I've buried enough good stock and good men in this territory to know when a threat like that wants taking serious. Cole and Amos had drifted over too by then, drawn by the tension still hanging in the yard. And for a moment, the four of them stood together in a loose half circle, the particular formation of people bracing, without quite saying so, for a fight none of them had asked for. We'll manage it, Silas said. Split the watches. Whit, you and Cole take first half the night. I'll take second with Amos. Amos, to his own visible surprise, didn't argue the pairing, just nodded once, something steadier in his face than had been there a week back. For what it's worth, boss, he said low, almost like it cost him something to say it. Out loud, whatever that man's planning, this crew's not going anywhere. Not while there's a fight worth having. Silas looked at him a moment, something recalibrating again. The same slow work of reassessment that had started the day. Amos apologized by the water trough. Noted, he said. Same word he'd used with Leon, weeks back. Meant just as much this time. He should have told her that night. He told himself he would, once he'd figured out how to say it, without putting more weight on her shoulders than she'd already agreed to carry. Except life, as it tends to, didn't wait for him to find the right words. With Thorne's threat hanging over the ranch, Silas found Leon out behind the house the next afternoon and set an old, well-kept revolver down on the fence post beside her. You should know how to use this, he said. No preamble, no softening it. Man like Thorne doesn't respect boundaries just because they're drawn fair. Better you're able to defend yourself than count on me being close enough every time. Leon looked at the revolver, then at him, something wary and something curious both moving behind her eyes at once. I know how to use a knife, she said. This is different. Different tool. Same idea. Come here. He showed her the grip first, patient in a way that surprised her, given how little patience he generally seemed to have for explaining himself about anything. Stood behind her, adjust her stance with light, careful touches at her elbow and shoulder, never anywhere he hadn't first, wordlessly, made sure she was comfortable with. Elbow soft, not locked, he said. You lock it. The recoil jar clean up into your shoulder. Breathe out before you squeeze. Don't yank the trigger. Just squeeze it. Slow, like you're closing a door you don't want to slam. Her first shot went wide, clipping nothing but open sky, and she flinched hard at the noise of it, more than she wanted to admit to. Loud, she said, faintly accusing as though the gun itself had personally offended her. Gets easier. Tell me things not get easier? Here, the coffee did not get easiest. Promise. Coffee's a lost cause. This isn't. He nodded at the target, an old tin can balanced on a fence post 30 feet off. Try again. Elbow soft, she did. Missed again, closer this time, close enough to knock the can half off its perch, and something in her face lit up despite herself, some old competitive spark that had nothing to do with grief or survival, and everything to do with simple human satisfaction. Again, she said, already resetting her stance without waiting for him to agree. By the fifth try, she hit it clean, the can, spinning off the post in a bright little clatter, and she turned to him with an expression of such pure, startled triumph that he laughed before he could stop himself, the sound rolling out of him easy, now no rust left in it at all. There, she said, pointing the emptied revolver, carefully at the ground rather than at him, some instinct for safety already taking root. You see, I am a natural. You should be very impressed. I'm impressed. Say it like you mean it. I mean it. And he did, watching her reset the can with brisk, satisfied movements, already asking to try again, already treating the whole exercise less like a lesson in fear and more like a game she intended to win. You're a fast study, Lee and Joe. Faster than most. I have had a great deal of practice, she said, quieter now. Something more serious, moving under the humor, learning things fast. When learning slow was not a choice life gave me. He didn't say anything to that. Just nodded. Understanding it the particular way. Two people understand each other when both have lived long enough on the hard side of a lesson to recognize the shape of it in somebody else. They practiced until the light went long and gold, and by the end of it she could hit the can 4 times out of 6, and something between them had shifted again, quiet and permanent. The particular shift that happens when a person trusts you enough to let you teach them how to protect themselves, and you prove worthy of being trusted with it. The morning before that Sunday, Leon spent an hour walking the strip of bare ground along the south wall of the house, pacing it off, crouching now and then to test the soil between her fingers. What are you doing? Silas asked. finding her there, brushing dirt from her palms with the particular satisfaction of someone who has just solved a problem she hadn't mentioned having. Deciding, she said. This dirt is not bad, not dry, with water carried regular. I think it would grow something worth growing. Grow what? Anything. She said it simply. But there was more underneath the word than he caught at first. In Guangdong, my grandmother kept a garden no bigger than this wall. Ginger, greens, a little bitter melon in the summer. It was not much by the size of it, but it was hers. Nobody could sell it out from under her or ship it away on a boat she never asked to board. She looked at the bare strip of ground a while longer, something private moving behind her eyes. I have not had a garden of my own since. 3 years is a long time to go without something that is only, entirely, yours to tend. Silas looked at the ground too, seeing it now the way she saw it, not as an unused strip of dirt beside the house, but as a question waiting for an answer. Ground's yours if you want it, he said. Whatever you plant, however you plant it. I'll have Cole dig a proper irrigation line off the spring. Once his arm's mended enough to hold a shovel without me worrying, he'll undo 2 weeks of healing in an afternoon. You would do that. Already said I would. Leanne looked at him a long moment, something soft and startled moving behind her usual composure, the particular surprise of a person unused to having small, ordinary wants taken seriously by someone with the power to grant them. Then yes, she said quieter now. I would like a garden. Something that grows because I decided it should, and stays growing because I keep choosing to tend it. It has been a long time since I got to choose something that's small and have it matter. Nothing that grows food is small, Silas said. Land taught me that much, if nothing else. She smiled at that, small and real, and the two of them stood together a while longer at the edge of the bare strip of ground, already, in their own quiet ways, planning a future neither one had let themselves plan out loud before. The Sunday before all that came due, the one quiet day the ranch generally allowed itself, Silas suggested riding out past the North Ridge, further than either of them had gone together before, to a stretch of high ground that caught the whole valley in a single sweeping view. Whit calls it Lookout, he said, as they climbed the last rise on foot, horses left tied below. My father called it something else. Never could remember what. What do you call it? Hadn't given it much thought, honestly. Wasn't much reason to come up here alone. From the top, the whole of Iron Hollow spread out below them, gold and green and dust brown, the creek a silver thread cutting through it all, the house small and steady at the center, like something a careful hand had set down deliberately, exactly where it belonged. It is bigger than I understood, Leon said quiet, taking it in. From the ground, a ranch is just fences and chores. From up here, it is a whole small kingdom. Don't know about kingdom. Kingdom implies somebody's in charge. Someone is always in charge, Leanne said, even if that someone insists otherwise out of modesty. He glanced at her sideways, something warm and amused in it. That's so, that is so. She sat down on a flat outcrop of rock, patting the space beside her, an invitation he accepted without hesitation now. The careful distance of their first nights on the trail long since worn away into something easier. Tell me something true. Not about the ranch. About you. Something I would not learn from watching you work. He thought about it a long moment, the particular silence of a man unused to being asked such a direct question, and trying honestly to answer it rather than deflect. Wanted to be a schoolteacher once, he said finally, almost sheepish about it. Before the ranch. Before Callie, even. Had this notion, young and foolish, of teaching kids their letters in some one-room schoolhouse somewhere. Never told anybody that. Not even her. Why not? Ranch needed running. Notions like that don't feed cattle. He shrugged, though. Something wistful lingered under the practicality of it. Your turn. Something true. Leon considered, the wind moving soft through her loosened hair, the whole Gold Valley spread below them like a held breath. I used to sing, she said, before the boat. My mother said I had a good voice, though mothers say such things, regardless of truth. I have not sung since I left Guangdong. Did not feel there was anything left worth singing about, most days. Sing something now. Now? Nobody's up here but the Hawks and me. Hawks won't judge you. I'll try not to, though I make no promises about my face. She laughed, startled, and shook her head. But something in his patient, waiting expression, no pressure in it. Only genuine curiosity eventually won out, and she sang a few soft lines in her own language, low and a little rusty from disuse, the melody old and simple, something her mother had likely sung to her own mother in turn. Generations of women passing a small tune hand to hand across more distance than either of them could properly measure. When she finished, the valley seemed for a moment to hold the silence of it a beat longer than silence usually asked for. That was beautiful, Silas said, entirely without performance in it. You do not even know what it means. Didn't need to. Some things you understand plain, whatever language carries them. Leanne looked at him a long moment, something soft and unguarded moving behind her eyes, and reached over, without quite deciding to, and took his hand where it rested on the rock between them. He didn't pull away. Laced his fingers through hers instead, easy, natural, like a thing they'd already done 100 times before, instead of the first time either of them had dared it. They sat like that a long while, watching the light shift slow across the valley below, saying nothing more, needing nothing more. Two people who had each spent years learning to expect very little from the world, allowing themselves, for one quiet Sunday afternoon, to expect something anyway. 2 days after Thorne's visit, Cole Ashby went down hard in the east pasture, thrown from a green colt that spooked at a rattler, and came up wrong, arm bent in a way arms weren't built to bend, a gash along his ribs from the same rock that had broken the fall. They carried him in on a door taken off its hinges, Witt's face gray with the particular fear of a man who has watched too many range accidents turn fatal out here, 2 days from any doctor worth trusting. Set the arm, Silas said, already moving furniture out of the way, already thinking through the long, hard ride to town and back that a proper doctor would require. I'll no time, Leanne said, and something in her voice had changed entirely, gone crisp and commanding in a way none of them had heard from her before. Boil water. Clean cloth as much as you have, and whiskey, whatever is strongest in this house. Silas hesitated half a second, some old instinct wanting to argue, wanting to insist on the town doctor, the proper channels, the safe and known thing. Silas. Her eyes locked on his, steady, absolutely certain. I trained under a real physician for 2 years, before the famine took my family's fortune, not just my grandmother's herbs. A doctor in Guangzhou, who took me as an apprentice because I would not stop asking questions until he let me. I know how to set a break. I know how to close a wound that will fester if it waits 2 days for someone in this territory to get here. Trust me now, or trust the road and pray the road is fast enough. Those are the only 2 choices you have. Something in her tone left no room for argument, and something in Silas the same thing that had raised his hand in that dusty street, without fully deciding to choose, in that moment to trust her completely. Do it, he said. What followed was 2 hours that none of them watching would ever quite forget. She worked with a speed and precision that had nothing amateur left out in it, nothing of the herb woman improvising with what she had. She talked Cole through the setting of his arm in a low, steady voice that somehow made a boy biting down on a leather strap feel almost calm, aligned the bone with hands that clearly knew the anatomy underneath the skin, splinted it clean and tight. She cleaned the gash along his ribs with a thoroughness that made Whit turn faintly green and step outside for air, packed it, stitched it with a bone needle she produced from her small kept bundle, each stitch even and sure, because that was the difference, and it showed itself in every motion. This wasn't guesswork. This was training. Years of it learned properly from someone who had seen worth in a girl asking too many questions and decided to answer them instead of silencing her. By the time she finished, full dark had fallen, and Cole lay pale but breathing even, fever not yet risen, the particular good sign that told a trained eye the worst danger had passed. She sat back on her heels, exhausted, hands finally shaking now that the work was done, and looked up to find every person in that room looking at her differently than they had an hour before. Ma'am, Whit said, voice rough. I have seen town doctors do worse work than that, and charge triple for the privilege. He will have fever tonight, Leanne said, too tired for modesty, too honest for false humility. Watch him. Cool cloths if it climbs too high. Call me if it does not break by morning. It broke by morning. Cole Ashby lived and walked crooked for a few weeks after, and told the story of that night for years afterward to anyone who'd listen, always ending it the same way. Woman saved my life with a sewing needle and a voice steady as church bells. Boss found himself the right kind of trouble, I'll tell you that much. Which wasn't quite true yet, that last part. Not officially, but something in the ranch's opinion of it had already quietly decided it was only a matter of time. It was that same night, hours after Cole finally saw And the house had gone dark and still. That Silas found Leanne sitting alone on the porch steps, staring out at nothing. Hands finally steady again. Wrapped around a cup of the coffee she still insisted was terrible. He sat down beside her. Didn't say anything at first. Just let the quiet hold them both for a while, the particular quiet of two people who have just survived something together and haven't yet found the words for what that survival cost. You never told me, he said finally, about the doctor. Guangzhou. You never asked how deep the water went, she said. Only how it started. My grandmother started it. A man named Dr. Han finished it, before the famine took everything he had built and mine along with it. She looked out at the dark hills, something distant in her eyes. He used to say knowledge like that belongs to whoever is brave enough to keep asking questions. I was very brave. Very foolish too, maybe. Someday. But brave. Not foolish, Silas said. Not tonight. Tonight you were the only reason that boy's still breathing. She looked at him then, something soft moving behind her tiredness. You trusted me. In there. When it mattered most. That is not a small thing, Silas Merrick. Most men would have argued for the doctor in the road, and Cole might have died waiting on that argument. Wasn't hard, he admitted. Trusting you, I mean. Been getting easier every day since that street. The word sat between them, larger than either of them, had quite meant to make them. And for a moment neither one moved, the porch dark and quiet around them, the stars doing their slow wheel overhead the same as they had the first night on the trail. Thorn came by, Silas said finally, deciding, in that fragile, honest quiet, that he owed her the rest of the truth he'd been sitting on, while you were resting after Feng left. Wanted an easement through the East Pasture water rights, is what he's really after. Said if I didn't cooperate, things might get difficult. Leon went very still. You should have told me. I know. A pause, something almost like a smile, rueful, self-aware. Seems I'm slow learning that particular lesson. You are, she agreed. But there was no sharp edge in it this time. Only something gentler. Something that had already begun quietly to forgive him for it. But you are learning. That is more than most men manage in a whole lifetime. Cole woke the next morning groggy and sore but clear-eyed, fever fully broken. And the first thing he did upon finding his voice again was demand in a scratchy, wounded tone to know why nobody had told him. A woman with a sewing needle could hurt worse than the fall that broke his arm in the first place. You screamed only twice, Leon said, checking his splint with brisk efficiency, entirely unmoved by the accusation. That is very good. Most men scream more. Most men, Cole said, aren't getting stitched up by someone who ties knots like she's furious at the thread personally. The thread did nothing to make me furious. You, however, kept moving your arm every time I told you not to. Reflexes. Reflexes that nearly cost you a crooked bone for the rest of your life. She tied off the last check of the splint, satisfied, and sat back. You will live, Cole Ashby. You will also, I think, tell this story a great many times, and it will grow more dramatic with each telling, until eventually you are fighting off a bear instead of falling off a colt. A bear's a good detail, Cole admitted, already grinning, despite the pain. Might use that. I expected as much. But there was warmth under the dryness, and Cole, catching it, reached out with his good hand and caught hers before she could stand. Thank you, he said. Now, all the joking dropped out of it. Truly. I know what almost happened last night, even half out of my head with the pain of it. I won't forget who kept it from happening worse. Lion looked at him a long moment, something soft moving behind her usual composure. You are welcome, she said simply. Now rest. Your arm will not heal faster for you talking so much. One more question. No, just one. Fine. One. Cole's grin turned sly, that bare detail. You think the boss would back me up on it if I told it around the branding fire this fall? I think the boss, Leon said, standing, already moving toward the door, has never told an exaggerated story in his life, and would look at you like you'd lost the rest of your mind along with your arm. Worth a shot, Cole called after her, laughing, despite the pain it clearly cost him, and the sound of it carried me warm through the house behind her. One more small proof, if she still needed any, that this strange, dry country had started, without her quite noticing when, to feel less like exile and more like something dangerously close to home. With Cole confined to a chair for a full week of recovery, unwilling to sit still and unable to work, Leon found him underfoot in the kitchen more often than not, and eventually put him to use rather than argue with his restlessness. You will learn to make dumplings, she announced one afternoon, setting a bowl of dough in front of him with the finality of a woman who had already decided the matter and saw no benefit in further discussion. One-handed. It will be terrible. That is acceptable. We will improve. I don't know the first thing about dumplings, ma'am. Neither did I the first time. My grandmother put a bowl in front of me, the same way, and told me the same thing. Terrible is how everyone begins. Whit wandered in partway through, drawn by the unfamiliar smell filling the kitchen, and found himself within 10 minutes, similarly recruited, his thick, careful rancher's hands pinching dough into shapes that made Leanne laugh outright, a sound rare enough that both men stopped what they were doing just to hear it. Properly. These look like boots, Whit said, holding one up for affectionately unimpressed with his own handiwork. Small, sad boots. They taste the same regardless of shape, Leanne said. Shape is only pride. Pride does not fill a stomach. By evening, the whole crew had gathered for a meal. None of them had eaten the like of before, misshapen dumplings and all. And Silas, watching from the head of the table as Cole argued with Amos, over whose dumplings looked more like actual food, felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't fully expected to feel again in his own lifetime. Not just a full house, a house that had learned without anyone quite planning it, how to be a family. Good? Leon asked him quietly, under the noise of the others, watching him take his first bite. Good, he said, and meant it entirely. All of it. Not just the food. She understood exactly what he meant, and didn't need to say anything else in reply. Just smiled, small and private, and passed him the plate for more. A neighboring rancher named Harmon Trask rode over the following afternoon, hat in hand, apologetic before he'd even dismounted, and the visit told Silas everything he needed to know about how far Thorn's reach had already spread through the valley. Didn't come to make trouble, Merrick, Trask said, not quite meeting his eyes. Came because Thorn's man was by my place yesterday, real friendly-like, mentioning how ranches that keep certain company sometimes find their water allocations reviewed come the dry season. Wasn't a threat exactly, just a mention. But you heard it as one. I heard it exact as it was meant to be heard. Trask finally looked up, something apologetic and something afraid, both fighting for space in his weathered face. I've got 4 kids and a wife who deserves better than what I can give her most years as it is. I can't afford to lose water rights over a fight that isn't strictly mine. Nobody's asking you to fight, Silas said, keeping his voice level, though something cold had settled into his chest at the confirmation of just how wide Thorn's shadow already stretched. Just wanted you to know where things stand plain, since you rode all this way to say it plain yourself, instead of just quietly pulling back like some folks would have. That's the least I owed you, Trask said. You pulled my boy out of a stampede 3 years back without asking what it cost you. I don't forget things like that. I just also can't afford to be a hero about it right now. Man's got to feed his family first, and be brave second, most days. I'm sorry it's got to be that way. No apology needed. Every man's got his own math to do. Trask nodded, relieved, and swung back up into his saddle and paused there a moment, looking toward the house, toward the window where Leon's shadow moved faintly behind the glass. For what it's worth, he said, quieter. Now my wife wanted me to say she thinks what you did in that street was decent. Said to tell you so, even if we can't stand alongside you the way decent folks ought to right now. Tell her I appreciate it. Trask rode off, and Silas stood a while in the yard watching him go, turning over the particular ache of watching good, frightened people choose caution over courage, understanding it completely and resenting it anyway. In the specific way a man resents a mirror that's showing him a decision he himself might have made in some other life, before a flooded wash and a raised hand had changed the shape of what kind of man he'd decided to be. That evening, he told Leon about the visit too. No hesitation in it this time. The lesson from the flower and the 4-day trip already well learned. The whole valley is watching, she said when he'd finished, waiting to see which way it breaks. Looks that way. Then we had better make sure it breaks the right direction, Leon said, steel coming into her voice, the particular steel he was learning to recognize as the truest part of her, whatever that costs. They sat together a while longer, the danger of Thorn's visit settling over them both like weather they could feel coming but not yet see, and somewhere out past the dark hills, 3 miles off on Thorn's own land, men were already moving in the moonless dark toward Iron Hollow's barn, carrying with them the particular cruelty of orders given by a man who had never once, in his whole comfortable life, had to watch something he loved actually burn. The smell woke her first, smoke sharp and wrong, threading in through the window she'd left cracked against the summer heat. Leanne was up and moving before her mind had fully caught the thought. Out of bed, at the window, seeing the orange glow already climbing the night sky from the direction of the barn, hearing, underneath the crackle and roar of it, the high, terrified screaming of horses trapped inside. Silas. Her voice tore through the house, raw with an urgency that had him up and moving before he was even fully awake, both of them running through the dark yard toward a wall of heat and light that seemed impossibly to have grown twice as large in the seconds it took to reach it. The barn was fully engulfed on the near side, flames climbing the old dry timber with a hunger that spoke of accelerant, of intent, of something set rather than something accidental, though there was no time now, none at all, to stop and think about who or why. Not with the horses still screaming inside. Whit and the others were already there, buckets useless against a blaze this size, and Silas grabbed a wet blanket from the trough without thinking, without a plan beyond the one animal instinct that had failed him once, at the edge of a flooded wash, and he had sworn ever since never to let fail him again. He went in through the near door, into smoke thick enough to swallow the world whole. Leanne was 3 steps behind him before anyone could stop her. No, Whit's voice, sharp with terror, grabbing at air where she'd already slipped past him. Ma'am, no, it's too far gone. She didn't stop, couldn't. Somewhere inside that burning barn were 3 horses who had done nothing to deserve this, who could not open a stall latch themselves, who would burn alive in the next few minutes if somebody didn't reach them. And something in Leanne Jo, something that had watched her own life get decided by other people's cruelty for 3 long years, simply refused in that moment to stand outside and watch anything else burn without a fight. Inside, the heat was a living thing, pressing against her skin, stealing the air from her lungs before she could even find it. She got low the way instinct screamed at her too, found the first stall by feel more than sight, fumbled the latch with fingers already going numb from smoke, and the horse inside, wild-eyed, screaming, half mad with terror, bolted past her toward the door the second it swung free. 1 down. 2 more. She was reaching for the second latch when the beam came down. Not on her, beside her. Close enough that the wash of heat and falling embers knocked her sideways, hard, into the stall wall. Close enough that a fresh curtain of flame now stood directly between her and the door she'd come in through. For 1 long, terrible second, Leanne Jo stood inside a burning building with no way out, smoke closing over her vision like water closing over something drowning, and some distant, panicked part of her mind screamed the same words over and over. Not like this. Not after everything. Not except then arms closed around her, hard and sure, and Silas Merrick's voice, rough with smoke, cutting through the roar. I've got you. Move now. He didn't wait for an answer. Pulled the second latch himself, freeing the last horse, and half-carried, half-dragged Leon toward a gap in the flames that hadn't been there a second before and wouldn't stay there much longer. And together, they broke through into the night air, coughing, staggering, the barn roaring and collapsing behind them in a shower of sparks that lit the whole yard bright as day. They went down together in the dirt, 20 feet clear of the heat, and Silas didn't let go, didn't loosen his grip even after the immediate danger had passed, holding her against his chest while she coughed the smoke out of her lungs, and the whole ranch crew came running with water buckets that were, by now, hopelessly, uselessly late. You could have died, he said, voice breaking on the words, all his usual stillness gone, stripped away by the particular terror of almost losing something he hadn't let himself name yet. You could have the horses. She managed, between coughs, stubborn even now, even here. Did they? All 3 clear. Whit called from somewhere nearby, voice thick with his own relief. All 3 clear, ma'am, thanks to you. Something in Silas's chest cracked open then, wide and undefended, and for the first time since the auction, since the crate, since the moment he'd first raised his hand in that dusty street, he let his hand come up now, cupped the side of her soot-streaked face, gentle, careful, like she was something precious he'd almost lost before he'd ever properly let himself have her. Don't do that again, he said, low, rough, barely above a whisper. Don't you ever do that again. I could not just stand there, Leeson said, looking up at him through smoke-stung eyes, something fierce and unbroken still burning behind the exhaustion. I have stood outside too many burning things in my life, Silas Merrick, and done nothing because no one gave me the choice to do anything else. I will not do it again. Not while I have hands that can open a latch." He looked at her for a long moment, the barn collapsing into embers behind them, the whole ranch crew standing witness in the firelit dark, and something settled in him then, quiet and absolute, the kind of certainty that doesn't need saying out loud to be entirely, permanently true. He had raised his hand once in a dusty street for a stranger he barely knew. He understood now, holding her, that he would raise it again, 1,000 times over, for exactly this woman, for exactly this reason, for as long as either of them had hands left to raise. Around them, the rest of the crew worked through the last of the danger, with the particular efficiency of people who had decided, without needing to discuss it, that panic was a luxury for later. Whit organized what water they had left into a line, meant less to save the barn already long past saving than to keep the fire from jumping to the house or the bunkhouse beyond it. Cole, splinted arm and all, hauled buckets one-handed until Whit physically pulled him off the line and ordered him to sit before he undid 2 months of healing in one reckless night. And Amos worked the hardest of anyone, soot-streaked and silent, dragging the 3 rescued horses further from the heat, checking each one over with rough, careful hands, making sure none of them had taken injury in the chaos. "They're clear," he reported to Silas afterward, voice rough from smoke, something unguarded in his face that hadn't been there 2 months back, in a different yard, over a different kind of fire entirely. All 3. Not even singed bad. "Thank you, Amos." Amos looked toward Leon, still catching her breath in Silas's arms 20 feet off, and something passed over his weathered face, complicated and sincere. "She went in for animals that never did a thing for her except eat the grain she fed them," he said, quiet, mostly to himself. Man could learn something from that, he was willing to. He walked off to help Whit with the last of the water buckets, and Silas watched him go, filing the moment away next to the corral apology from weeks back. Understanding now, with a clarity, the fire seemed to have burned clean into him, that some people changed slow and some people changed all at once, and either way counted, so long as the change held. Behind them, the barn finished its collapse into a bright, roaring ruin, and somewhere in the wreckage, come morning light, Whit would find hoofprints leading away from the ranch that matched no horse belonging to Iron Hollow, prints belonging to riders who had come in the dark, done their cruel work, and ridden back out toward the lights of Redstone Flats before anyone thought to give chase. Prints, though none of them knew it yet, that led in exactly the direction of a man who had smiled easily 2 days before and promised in his own quiet, cruel way that fires happen. For now, though, there was only the fire dying down to embers, and the horses safe in the corral, and 2 people sitting together in the dirt of a yard that had nearly cost them everything, holding on to each other like the ground itself might still give way. It didn't. It held. And for the first time since a crate in a dusty street, Silas Merrick understood, with a clarity that frightened him more than the fire had, exactly what he stood to lose now. If Garrett Thorne got what he wanted, everything. He stood to lose everything. He wasn't about to let that happen. Not while he still had a hand left to raise. Morning came up gray, with smoke still hanging low over the yard, and the barn that had stood there the night before was nothing now but a black skeleton of timber, still ticking as it cooled, still breathing thin curls of smoke up into a sky that had the nerve to be perfectly blue. Whit found the tracks before breakfast. Didn't have to look hard. They were right there at the edge of the wash, plain as a signature, 4 sets of shod hooves cutting east toward Redstone Flats, and pressed into the soft dirt beside them, half buried, a single spur rowel snapped clean off somebody's boot in the scramble to get gone fast. He brought it to Silas without a word. Just held it out. Silas turned it over once. A design stamped into the metal. Small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A brand shaped like a thorn wrapped around a T-well. Whit said, quiet, grim. "There's your answer if you were still needing one." "Wasn't needing one," Silas said. Just needed proof enough to say it out loud without it sounding like grief talking. Because that was the danger of it, and he knew it even as the anger climbed up through his chest like heat through a chimney. A man says another man burned his barn without proof, and all anybody hears is a man who lost something and needs somewhere to point the hurt. Say it with a spur rowel stamped with a thorn wrapped around a T in his open hand, though. That was a different conversation entirely. Leon came out onto the porch behind him, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill. Soot still smudged along her jaw no matter how many times she'd scrubbed at it, And she looked at the burned skeleton of the barn, and then at the small metal piece sitting in Silas's palm, and something in her face went very still and very focused. "That is his," she said, "not a question." "That's his," Silas confirmed. "Then we have him," she said, "simple, certain." The particular certainty of someone who has waited a long time for the world to hand her proof of a cruelty she'd already known was there. "We have a piece of him," Silas said. "Not the same as having him. Man like Thorn, he'll have 3 witnesses ready to swear his whole crew was drinking at his own table the night of the fire. Paper and metal don't argue with a lie that well-funded. Not by themselves. Then we make them argue," Leon said. "We find more. We find the paper, the real one, underneath the lie. Every forged thing has a true shape hiding under it, if you look close enough." She was already thinking it through. He could see it moving behind her eyes, and something in him tired, singed at the edges, grieving a barn and 3 horses who'd nearly died, and a peace that had lasted exactly 3 weeks before the world came looking for it. Something in him steadied, watching her think. "You always this stubborn before breakfast," he said. "I am this stubborn every hour of every day," she said. "Breakfast has nothing to do with it." Whit stood a little apart, watching the two of them turn the wreckage into the beginning of a plan instead of only a loss, and something in his weathered face settled into an expression he didn't often wear. 11 years I ran this place alongside just the boss, and whatever quiet he carried in him," he said, mostly to himself, though loud enough that both of them heard it. "Didn't figure I'd live to see it get loud again. Good loud, I mean. The kind worth having." "Careful," Whit, Silas said. Some of the morning's grimness cracking, finally, into something warmer. "Man might start thinking you've gone sentimental in your old age." "Man might be right," Whit said, entirely unbothered by the accusation, and went to go check on the horses, a small, satisfied smile tucked into the corner of his weathered mouth the whole way there. And there it was again, that small crack of a smile at the corner of his mouth, out of place against the burned wreckage behind them, and stubborn in its own right, refusing to stay buried under everything trying to smother it. They rode into town 2 days later, not for the fight yet, only for the fact-finding. And the town wore its hostility openly now, no pretense left in it. Storefronts that would have nodded a polite hello a month ago now found urgent business. Elsewhere, the second Silas and Leon rode down the main street. Kane's saloon window had a hand-lettered sign in it that hadn't been there before. No further credit extended to Iron Hollow accounts. Nothing about why. Didn't need to say why. Everybody in Redstone Flats already knew why. They went instead to the county recorder's office, a narrow building wedged between the bank and a boarded-up assay shop, where a thin, ink-stained man named Abel Rourke kept ledgers of every land claim and debt transfer filed in the district, going back longer than most of the buildings around him had stood. The office smelled of dust and dried ink, and the particular must of paper that has sat undisturbed in a drawer for years. And Rourke himself looked very much like his office, thin and dry and precise, spectacles perched low on his nose, a man who had clearly long ago made peace with a life spent in the company of other people's records instead of his own. He glanced up when they entered, taking in Silas first, then Lion, and something in his manner careful, unhurried, entirely without the particular coldness the rest of Redstone Flats had taken to showing them, suggested a man who kept his own counsel separate from the town's. "Merrick," he said, "been a while since you had cause to visit my little corner of the world, and this would be the young lady half the county's been buzzing about." He nodded at Leon, polite and entirely unbothered, in a way that felt, after weeks of averted eyes and hostile silences, almost startlingly ordinary. "Ma'am, what can I do for the two of you today?" "Need your eyes on a paper," Silas said, "and your honesty, if you've got it to spare. Man like you sees a lot of ink in a lifetime. I'm hoping you've seen enough to tell real from built." Rourke's eyebrows lifted slightly, curiosity sharpening behind his spectacles. "Now that's an interesting request. Let's have it then." He examined the paper Silas handed across the counter with the particular slow patience of a man who loved his work more than he loved most people, holding it up to the window light, turning it, squinting at the ink, where the 3 separate signatures crowded close together at the bottom. He said, which, from Abel Rourke, apparently counted as an exclamation. What?" Silas said. "This top signature." Rourke tapped it with one ink-stained finger. "Iron gall ink, common enough. But this one here, second from top, that's a bottled ink, manufactured, sold out of Tucson. Wasn't common out here 2 years back when this transfer's dated. Wasn't available. At all, matter of fact, until about 8 months ago. He looked up over his spectacles. Somebody wrote the middle of this paper a lot more recently than the date on it claims. Leanne leaned in close, studying the signatures herself, something sharpening behind her eyes. This flourish, she said slowly, tracing a finger just above the paper, not quite touching it. This little curl at the end of the letters, I have seen this hand before. Silas looked at her. Where? The night I arrived in Redstone Flats, before the auction. A man came to the room where they kept us, made me put my mark on papers I could not fully read yet, my English still too new to trust. He had this same curl, this same small flourish at the end of every letter, like he was proud of his own handwriting and could not help showing it off even on papers meant to steal from someone. Her jaw tightened. I did not know his name, but I would know that hand again anywhere. It belongs to the man who works for Thorne, his clerk. I have heard the ranch hand say his name in town, Dobbs. Ezra Dobbs. Rourke's eyebrows climbed. Ezra Dobbs does file paperwork for Thorne's holdings regular, has for years. Something settled into place then, quiet and enormous, the last piece of a shape that had been assembling itself since a folded paper first raised a frown on a dusty trail 3 weeks back. Would you swear to that? Silas said. The ink. The date's not lining up. I'd swear to what my own eyes and 30 years of handling paper tell me, Rourke said. Whether that's enough to satisfy a circuit judge is a different question. But it's enough to say out loud in front of witnesses, if you're of a mind to. I'm of a mind to, Silas said. Leon looked at him. Something fierce and steady passed between them. The particular understanding of two people who have decided, together, that quiet was no longer an option. Then we make him answer for it, she said. In front of everyone who ever looked away. Thorne moved first, he always did. That was the shape of him. Silas was learning a man who mistook speed for strength, who struck before anyone else could finish gathering their proof, because he'd built his whole life on the wager that fear moved faster than truth. The notice went up outside the county office 3 days later, in Thorne's own hand this time, no clerk's flourish needed, formal and public, and dressed up in exactly enough legal language to look unassailable to anyone who hadn't spent the last week studying every letter of it. Notice of unresolved indenture. The Chinese woman known as Leon Zhou remains under territory law, subject to an outstanding labor debt, said debt held in trust by Garrett Thorne following irregular transfer proceedings. Any party currently harboring said woman is instructed to surrender her to lawful claim, in person, at Redstone Flats, on the coming Saturday, or answer to charges of unlawful detainment of another man's property. Witt read it twice through, standing in the street, and swore low and long enough that a passing woman covered her ears and hurried on. He's twisting it, Witt said, making himself the wronged party, making you the thief, boss, for keeping what you already paid honest money for. That's the play, agreed, jaw tight. Force the fight into the open, on his ground, in front of a crowd he thinks still fears him more than they trust us. Bet the whole thing on that fear holding one more time. Leon stood reading the notice with a stillness that worried Silas more than shouting would have. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, and carried something underneath it that had nothing left of fear in it at all. Then Saturday, she said, we prove his fear is worth less than he thinks it is. The days leading up to it moved strange, the way days do before something everyone can feel coming. Slow and fast at once. Silas rode to 2 neighboring ranches, men he trusted, men who'd lost water and grazing rights to Thorne's slow encroachment over the years and never had proof enough to fight it, and he laid the whole thing out plain: the forged paper, the clerk's flourish, the fire, the spur for rowel with its thorn wrapped around a T. Neither man needed convincing twice. Old Fang arrived again the night before, walking the same long road, this time not alone, 3 other men from the mining camps beside him, quiet, weathered, carrying between them the particular courage of people who have decided that silence has cost them enough for one lifetime. We will stand in that street Saturday, Old Fang said, not to fight, to be seen. A man like Thorne counts on us, staying invisible. We stop being invisible, some of his fear runs out. And Amos Pratt Amos, of all people, who had sneered at Leon across a corral, not 2 months showed up at the porch that same evening, hat in his hands, jaw working like the words cost him something to spend. Wanted to say, he started, then stopped, then tried again. What I said to you, ma'am. Out by the water that day. That was low. I've thought on it plenty since, especially watching you go into that eye fire for animals that weren't even yours to save. He swallowed. Whatever's coming Saturday, I'll be standing with the boss. With you too, if you'll have it. Leanne studied him a long moment, weighing it the way she weighed everything, and then nodded once, accepting the apology on its own terms without pretending the wound it covered had never happened. Stand, she said. That is enough. Later, Whit found Amos out by the corral again, same spot as the water trough conversation weeks back, and this time sat down beside him without any lecture ready in his mouth. You did good tonight, Whit said. Simple. Earned. Wasn't looking for a medal, Whit. Wasn't offering one. Just saying it plain, since plain seems to be the only language that sticks around here lately. Whit looked out over the dark corral. The horses settled and quiet after the long day's tension. 3 years back, when you first hired on, I told the boss I wasn't sure about you. Too quick with your temper, too slow with your thinking. Figured you'd either grow out of it or get somebody hurt trying. Which one you figure now? Ask me Sunday, Whit said, but there was warmth under the gruffness, and Amos, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, actually smiled. 2 more neighboring families rode over that final evening before Saturday, word having spread quiet and fast through the valley, the particular way word travels when people are hungry for a reason to hope. They didn't come armed, didn't come looking for a fight, just came to stand, the same way Old Fang's people intended to stand, adding their own quiet weight to a scale that had been tipped too long in one direction. Silas found himself, that final night, standing on his own porch looking out at a yard fuller than it had been in the 4 years since Callie died. Neighbors, hands, strangers from the mining camps, all of them gathered loose and quiet under the stars, waiting together for a morning none of them could be entirely sure would end well. Leanne came to stand beside him, following his gaze out over the gathered crowd. This is not what Thorne is expecting, she said. He is expecting a rancher and a woman standing alone. He does not know how many quiet debts a man collects, riding this valley for years, doing right by people when nobody was watching. Hope you're right. I am usually right, she said, and there was enough steel under the small joke that he almost believed her completely. Whatever happens tomorrow, Silas Merrick, you did not build this alone. Remember that in the street, if your hand starts to shake, my hand doesn't shake. Everyone's hand shakes, Leanne said. The brave ones just raise it anyway. Saturday came up hot and still, the whole sky the color of old brass, and Leanne woke before the sun had properly cleared the hills, finding Silas already dressed, already standing at the kitchen window, watching the gray light gather over land that might, by evening, belong to a very different kind of future than the one they'd started building. You did not sleep, she said. Not a question. Some. He turned from the window, and something his face, usually so carefully unreadable, showed plain for once. Unguarded in the particular way exhaustion strips a person down to what's actually underneath. Kept thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. All the ways I could stand in that street and still lose you anyway. Paper or no paper. Truth or no truth. Leanne crossed the kitchen and took his hands in hers. Steady, deliberate. The same steadiness she brought to every wound she'd ever closed. Then stop thinking about losing, she said, and start thinking about what you are standing for. Instead, makes a man's hand shake, purpose steadies it. You told me that yourself in different words the night of the fire, did I? You did. You simply did not know you were saying something wise at the time. Most wise things slip out of you sideways. Silas Merrick, like you are embarrassed to be caught having them on purpose. That startled a small, real laugh out of him. Exactly the tonic she'd intended, and some of the tightness went out of his shoulders. Whatever happens today, he said. Quieter now, serious again but steadier with it. I need you to know none of it changes what I already know to be true. About you. About us. Paper can lie. That doesn't. I know, Leanne said. I have known for some time now. I was simply waiting for you to catch up to saying it out loud. He almost smiled at that, and for a moment, standing together in the gray early light of a day that would decide more than either of them wanted to fully name. Something passed between them that needed no further words at all. They rode into town together an hour later, the whole crew falling in behind them, and by mid-morning the street outside Kane's saloon had filled with more people than Redstone Flats usually saw for anything short of a hanging. Because that's what this had become, whether anyone said the word out loud or not. A trial, held in the open street, with the whole town standing jury. Silas stood at the far end of the street an hour before the appointed time, Leanne beside him, Whit and Cole and Amos flanking them both, and watched the town fill in slow around them. Storekeepers who'd refused Cole's business 2 weeks back stood now in their own doorways, unwilling to fully commit but unwilling, too, to look away. Women who'd pulled their children close at the sight of Leon on that first day stood now at the edges of the gathering crowd, watching with an expression that had curiosity in it now instead of only fear. Old Feng and his 3 companions arrived exactly on time, walking the last stretch of road together, unhurried, and took their place just behind Silas, without a word needing to pass between them. 2 more families from neighboring ranches rode in shortly after, dismounting quiet, adding their own weight to the gathering. The church bell, such as it was an old iron triangle hung outside the feed store that served the town for every purpose a proper bell might have served, elsewhere sounded the hour, and the whole street seemed to draw one collective breath and hold it. Thorn arrived flanked by 6 men this time, more than he'd ever needed for a simple property dispute. The particular overkill of a man trying to make fear do the arguing his facts couldn't manage on their own. He sat his horse in the center of the street with the same easy arithmetic smile he always wore, and his eyes found Silas and Leon standing together at the far end, Whit and Cole and Amos flanking them, Old Feng and his 3 companions standing just behind, quiet and immovable as stones. Merrick, Thorn called out, voice pitched to Carrie, playing to the crowd now, every word a performance. Come to do this the easy way, I hope. Hand over what's mine. Save everybody a lot of unpleasantness. She was never yours, Silas said, and his voice, though quieter, carried just as far. The particular carrying that comes from a man who has nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. I paid, I cut the rope. I will not lower my hand for you, Thorn. Not today. Not ever. Something rippled through the crowd at that, a murmur, the sound of people remembering. All at once, the exact same words spoken in this exact same street 2 months back. Thorn's smile thinned. Sentiment's a fine thing, Merrick. Doesn't hold up in front of a judge, though, and the paper says, the paper's a lie, Lyanne said. Her voice, though smaller than either man's, cut through the street like a blade, and the crowd's murmur died entirely, every eye swinging toward her. She stepped forward, unhurried, chin lifted, exactly as it had been lifted on that crate 2 months ago, and this time there was no rope on her wrists, and no crowd waiting to see whether she'd break. I did not sign this debt willingly, she said. Each word placed careful and clear the English she'd worked so hard to master, carrying now with a strength that silenced every whisper trying to rise against it. I signed papers I could not fully read, put in front of me by a man with a particular way of writing his letters. A little curl. Very proud of it, this man. Proud enough that even when forging documents to steal a woman's freedom, he could not help but sign his own pride into every page. She held up the paper, the one Rourke had examined, the one with its mismatched inks and impossible dates. Ezra Dobbs, she said, your clerk. His hand is on this paper, written months after the date it claims. I know his flourish because I watched him make it, the night I could not yet read enough English to understand what I was signing away. A stir moved through the crowd, and Thorn's easy smile had gone brittle now, cracking at the edges, his eyes flicking toward one of his own riders, a thin, nervous man near the back who had gone very pale and very still. The street had gone utterly still, the particular silence of a whole town, holding its breath at once, waiting to see whether this small, steady woman could actually make the accusation stick against a man who had never, in all his years in this valley, been made to answer for anything. That's a serious accusation, Thorn said, recovering too fast the practiced smoothness of a man who had talked his way out, of worse, from a woman with every reason to lie her way out of a lawful debt. Then let Abel Rourke speak, Silas said. County recorder. 30 years reading paper in this territory. He'll tell you what the ink tells him. Won't cost you a thing to listen, Thorn, unless you're afraid of what listening might prove. Rourke stepped forward from where he'd been waiting at the crowd's edge, ledger under one arm, and laid out, plain and unhurried, exactly what he'd told Silas 3 days before. The mismatched inks. The impossible dates. 30 years of expertise standing in that street, with nothing to gain from lying and everything to lose from staying silent. The crowd's murmur rose again, sharper now, edged with something that hadn't been there before, doubt. Not in Silas, in Thorn. It was into that exact fraying moment that the trouble finally broke loose, the way trouble does, sideways and sudden, refusing to wait for anyone's speech to properly finish. Time did the strange thing it does in moments like that, slowing at the edges even as everything inside it moved too fast to properly track. One of Thorne's riders, the thin, pale one who'd gone still at the mention of Dobbs's name, must have decided, in the particular panic of a cornered man watching his own guilt read aloud in front of a whole town, that the only way out was through. His horse's ears went back. His hand found his holster, before his mind seemed to have fully caught up with the decision his body had already made. He spurred his horse hard toward the gap between Silas and the crowd, dust kicking up in a sudden violent spray, and half the street flinched back as one. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds, though it would stretch, in the memory of everyone watching, into something that felt far longer. Amos Pratt moved first, throwing himself into the horse's path, and the animal reared, screaming, throwing its rider hard into the dirt, the man's own gun discharging harmlessly into open sky as he fell. He came up wrong. Arm bent beneath him at an angle that made half the crowd wince on instinct. A gash opened along his scalp from the fall, blood running fast and bright down into the dust. Nobody moved to help him. Not one of Thorne's own men, still mounted, still watching their boss for a cue that wasn't coming. Not the crowd, still too stunned by the suddenness of it all. Leanne moved. She crossed the open street at a run, dropped to her knees beside a man who, 5 minutes earlier, had been riding in Thorne's crew against her, and her hands went to work with the same speed and certainty they'd shown over Cole Ashby's broken arm 2 months back, pressing cloth torn from her own sleeve against the scalp wound, checking the angle of the arm with quick, sure fingers. "Hold still," she said to him. Low, steady, no trace of anger in it. "Despite everything. You are frightened, that is making it worse. Breathe. I have you." The man, young, younger than she'd realized up close, barely past 20, clearly hired for muscle rather than conviction, stared up at her with something like disbelief. "Why?" he managed through gritted teeth. "Why help me? I rode against you." "Because you are hurt," Leanne said. Simple, final, as though the answer required no more explanation than that. That is enough reason. It was always going to be enough reason. The street had gone utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the woman kneeling in the dust binding the wound of a man who, minutes before, had drawn a gun in service of the enemy trying to claim her as property. Something moved through Thorne's remaining riders in that silence. Something Silas watched happen, in real time, a shift passing man to man like current through wire. One rider looked at another. Neither looked at Thorne. A third, slowly, deliberately lowered the hand that had been resting near his own holster. Because that was the thing, about fear. Silas understood, watching it happen. It only worked as long as it stayed the strongest thing in the room. And there, kneeling in the dirt of a public street, a woman Thorne had tried to paint as property had just shown every hired gun. In earshot, something stronger than fear. Mercy, freely given to an enemy. That had a way of making fear look very small and very cheap by comparison. "This changes nothing," Thorne said, but his voice had lost its easy music now, gone thin and strained, a man watching his own advantage evaporate in real time and unable to stop it. "The debt stands regardless of one clerk's handwriting. I'll have this settled by a judge, in a proper courtroom, not a street theater staged by staged," Old Feng said, stepping forward for the first time, his voice carrying clear and unhurried across the street. "You use that word easy, Thorne. Let me tell you what is staged. 4 years ago, your riders chased me into a flooded wash for the sport of watching a man run. A woman died, pulling me out of that water. I have carried her name in my prayers every night since." He gestured to the 3 men beside him. "These men worked your camps too. We have all carried scars from your particular kind of business. We are done staying invisible so you can keep pretending none of it happened." The crowd had gone very still, listening now in a way that had nothing performative left in it, the particular stillness of people finally hearing a truth they'd suspected for years and never had the courage to say out loud themselves. An old miner near the front took off his hat, slow without seeming to notice he'd done it, the particular unconscious respect a man pays when words land somewhere deeper than manners usually require. A woman near the back pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes bright, and did not look away, because that was the second thing happening in that street, underneath the confrontation itself. A town was watching people it had spent years pretending not to see, finally properly seeing them. "He is lying," Thorne said, but the words came out too fast, too thin, and even he seemed to hear how little weight they carried anymore. "Am I?" Old Feng said. "Ask your own remaining men, Thorne. Ask them how many fires they have set at your word, how many papers they have watched Dobbs forge. Ask them how much longer they intend to risk a hanging rope protecting a man who would not cross the street to help a single one of them if the fear ran the other direction. Nobody answered for a long moment. Then, deliberate, one of Thorne's riders swung down off his horse, set his hand well clear of his holster, walked without a word to stand at the edge of the crowd instead of beside his employer. A second followed, then a third. Thorne sat alone on his horse in the middle of the street, his easy smile entirely gone now, watching his own hired strength dissolve around him one quiet defection at a time. And something in his face, for just a moment, showed the whole shape of a man who has spent his entire life building power out of other people's fear and has just now, too late, discovered what happens when that fear finally runs dry. Garrett Thorne. Silas's voice, when it came, was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. The whole street was listening now, every ear in Redstone Flats straining to catch every word. You've got a choice in front of you. Same kind of choice I gave a woman on a crate 2 months back, if you want the comparison. Ride out of this territory today and don't come back. Or stay and answer to every man in this street about the fires you've set, and the papers you've forged, and the people you've spent years treating like they weren't people at all. You think you can just, I think, Silas said, cutting through it, calm as still water, that you spent your whole life betting on people staying too afraid to look you in the eye. That bet just failed. Look around you, Thorne. Count the men who used to work for that fear. Then tell me how good you like the odds now. Thorne looked, really looked, for the first time, taking in the whole street, his own men standing apart from him, Old Fang and his companions unbroken and unafraid, Whit and Cole and Amos standing solid beside Silas, the crowd itself, once so willing to look away, now watching him with an expression that had nothing left of fear in it, and a great deal that looked uncomfortably like judgment. Whatever calculation ran behind his eyes in that moment, it landed, finally, on the only math that still made sense. He said, nothing more. Gathered his reins with hands that weren't quite steady, turned his horse, and rode out of Redstone Flats at a pace just short of a run, alone, none of his remaining men following, the dust of his going settling slow over a street that had, for the first time in longer than most of them could remember, stopped being afraid. Nobody cheered. That surprised Silas later, thinking back on it. No triumphant shout, no rush of celebration. Just a long-held breath finally released, and the particular quiet of a town realizing, all at once, how much smaller its fear had made it, and how strange the sudden space of freedom felt now that the fear had gone. Kane stepped out from behind his own saloon doorway, slow, uncertain, and made his way through the thinning crowd toward where Silas stood. Stopped a few feet off, hat in his hands, something unpracticed and awkward in his whole bearing. A man clearly working through words he'd never expected to need. Merrick. He cleared his throat. That order Cole came for a few weeks back. Full order. On the house this trip. Least I can do given. He gestured vaguely at the street, at the dispersing crowd, at the whole shape of what had just happened. Given I had a hand in dressing up that first sale nice and legal looking. Back at the start. Didn't know how deep the lie ran when I did it. That's not much of an excuse. But it's the truth, and I figured you'd earned a bit of that today. Figured right, Silas said. Not warm, not yet, but not cold either. We'll see how the next few months go, Kane, before I decide what to make of an apology that only showed up once the winning side was clear. Kane nodded, accepting the terms without argument, and retreated back toward his saloon. And Leanne, watching the whole exchange from where she still knelt in the dust, allowed herself a small, tired, unsurprised smile. Cowards make good weather vanes, she said, when Silas crouched back down beside her. They tell you which way the wind has already turned. Not brave, but useful sometimes, in their own small way. That's a generous read on a man who nearly starved us out over flour. I did not say I forgave him, Leanne said. I said he was useful. There is a difference, same as I taught you weeks ago, about fine and honest. Leanne was still kneeling in the street, finishing the binding on the young rider's arm, when Silas crossed to her and crouched down beside her, watching her work with the same steady care she'd shown all along. You didn't have to do that, he said, quiet, just for her. Help him. After everything. I know, she said, not looking up, focused on the last of the binding. That is why I did it. She finished, sat back, looked up at Silas with something exhausted and radiant moving behind her eyes all at once. It is over, she said. Not quite a question. More like she needed to hear the words out loud to fully believe them. Not all of it, Silas said. There's still a life left to build once we're home. But this part, yes. This part's over. She let him help her up this time. No argument in it. Her hand fitting into his like it had always belonged there. And for a long moment they simply stood together in the middle of a street that had almost cost them everything. Saying nothing at all, needing nothing more than the fact of standing there together, upright, unbroken, alive. They rode home slow, the whole crew trailing behind them, Old Feng and his companions walking a stretch of the road alongside, before turning off toward the camps. Promises exchanged to visit again soon, this time for no reason darker than the pleasure of each other's company. The burned skeleton of the barn still stood black against the evening sky. When they rode into the yard, a wound the land would carry for a while yet. But past it, past the wreckage, the house stood whole and lit gold with the last of the sun, and something in the sight of it, whole and standing and waiting, settled deep into both of them. That night, after the crew had eaten and scattered to their bunks, after the ranch had finally gone quiet for the first time, in what felt like weeks, Silas found Lion on the porch again. The same steps where they'd sat the night of Cole's fever, the same stars beginning their slow wheel overhead. He sat down beside her. Didn't say anything for a long while. Just let the quiet hold them. Easy now, no longer strained with things unsaid. I've been thinking, he said finally, about what happens now. About the ranch. About you. That is a lot to think about all at once, Leon said. But there was warmth in it, an invitation rather than a deflection. He reached into his coat and drew out a single sheet of paper, blank, unmarked, and held it out to her in the lamplight, spilling from the kitchen window. She looked at it, looked at him. Write your own name on this land, Silas said, quiet, steady, no flourish in it, no grand speech, just the plain, whole truth of a man laying everything he had at somebody's feet without asking for anything back. Or leave if that's what you want instead. Both are yours to choose. Always were. I bought your freedom in a dusty street 2 months ago, and I'll say the same thing now, I said then. The choice is yours. It will always be yours. Leanne took the paper, held it a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular weight of a blank page that could hold whatever future she chose to write onto it, hers and no one else's to decide. She thought of a crate in a dusty street, of a promise made to a mother half a world away, that she would not die like something owned, of a rope cut free, and a hand raised high and refusing to lower, and a long dry road that had led her, against every likelihood, to exactly this porch, exactly this night, exactly this man sitting beside her with his whole quiet heart laid open in his hands. She reached for the pen he'd set beside the paper, and she wrote her name, not beneath his. Beside it 2 names, side by side, equal weight, equal claim, on land that had nearly burned and somehow, against everything Thorne had tried to take from it, still stood. Silas watched her write it, watched the careful, sure strokes of her hand, forming letters in a language she'd fought so hard to master, and something in his chest closed tight for 4 long, grieving years, opened the rest of the way. Iron Hollow, he said softly, testing the shape of a future he hadn't let himself imagine in longer than he could remember, belongs to both of us now, officially, on paper and everywhere else that matters. Everywhere else that matters, Leanne repeated, and for the first time since a crate in a dusty street, since a rope cut free, since a whole world that had tried, over and over, to convince her she was worth less than the dirt under everyone else's boots, she let herself smile without holding anything back at all. The weeks that followed carried their own slow, quiet proof that a single Saturday in the street, however decisive, hadn't fixed a whole valley's fear overnight. Change, Silas was learning, rarely arrived all at once. It arrived the way water arrived to dry ground, after a long drought, slow at first, soaking in unevenly, some patches greening quicker than others, some staying stubborn and cracked a good while longer. The new barn went up in early autumn, neighbors and mining camp families alike turning out to raise it together. An entire day of hammers and laughter and shared food that would have been unthinkable 3 months back. Harmon Trask brought his whole family, his wife pressing a jar of preserves into Leon's hands with an apology neither of them needed spoken aloud. Old Feng came down from the camps with 4 more companions this time, and stayed a full week, teaching Cole, of people, 3 words of a language he butchered even worse than Silas did, to Leon's endless delighted amusement. It was around the evening fire, Once the last rafter had been raised and the whole tired, satisfied crowd had settled in with plates of food and cups of something stronger than coffee, that Cole finally made good on a threat issued back in the spring. "So there I was," he began, arm long since healed but held up anyway for dramatic effect, flat on my back in the east pasture, and this creature comes tearing out of the brush. "A colt," Silas said from across the fire, entirely deadpan. "It was a colt, Cole. It was a considerable animal, is what it was, and I'm getting to the bear. There was no bear. There is always a bear, boss, if a man tells the story right." Cole grinned around the fire at the assembled crowd, thoroughly unrepentant, and Lion, seated beside Silas with a mug of cider warming her hands, laughed loud enough that half the gathering turned to look, delighted at the sound of it. "He asked me for that detail myself," she informed the fire at large, entirely unbothered by betraying the conspiracy. "Months ago. I did warn him it would grow with the telling. It has grown considerable," Wood agreed, solemn as a judge. "Started as a colt. Now I hear it's near enough a grizzly. Give it another winter," Cole said, entirely undeterred, "and I expect it'll have wings." The whole fire roared with laughter at that, warm and easy under a sky just beginning to cool toward autumn, and Silas, watching it all the new barn standing pale and solid behind them, the crowd that would not have gathered like this a season back, the woman beside him, laughing loud and unguarded at a joke she'd helped build herself, felt something settle into place that no forged paper or burned barn or departed enemy could ever quite unsettle again. Not just a ranch rebuilt. A whole small world remade. Not everyone came around. A handful of families kept their distance still, old fear too deeply worn into old habit to shift easily. And Silas made his peace with that the way he'd made his peace with plenty else in his life, accepting what he couldn't change, working steady at what he could. Redstone Flats itself settled into something that wasn't quite reconciliation, not yet, but was at least no longer active hostility. Kane's credit stayed open, grudging but steady. The county recorder's office quietly processed 3 more inquiries that autumn from other Valley families who'd long suspected irregularities in their own dealings with Thorne's old operation, emboldened by a street full of witnesses who'd watched one lie finally come apart in daylight. The young rider Leon had knelt over in the dust. His name turned out to be Ellis. They learned eventually, though he'd been too rattled that day to offer it, showed up at Iron Hollow's gate on foot in late September, hat in hand, scar still pink along his hairline, where the fall had opened his scalp. "Didn't know where else to go, ma'am," he said, when Liam came out to see who'd come calling. Thorne's men scattered every direction once he rode off. Most of us weren't much more than hired muscle to begin with. And hired muscle doesn't have a place to land once the man who hired it disappears. "Why come here?" Silas asked. Not but not entirely trusting yet either. "Because she patched me up every reason not to, Ella said, nodding toward Leon. Something raw and unpracticed in the honesty of it. I've thought on that a great deal since. Man doesn't forget a kindness like that easy. Especially not one he didn't earn. Figured if there was any decent work going, I'd rather earn my keep somewhere that showed me what decent actually looks like firsthand. In the dirt of a street, I rode into meaning trouble. Silas studied him a long moment. The particular careful weighing he brought to every new thing that wandered onto his land, and looked to Leon, who studied Alice with her own quiet, unhurried attention. You would work hard, she said. Not quite a question. Harder than I ever worked for Thorn, ma'am. That's a low bar, but I intend to clear it by a wide margin. Leon looked at Silas. Something passed between them, wordless. The particular shorthand two people build after months of choosing and beginning to trust each other's instincts. There's a bunk open, Silas said finally. Cole could use the extra hand come next branding. Once his arm's fully sound. Pays fair. Works honest. First sign you're not, you're gone. That's not a threat. That's just how this land runs. Now, understood, sir. Thank you. Ellis turned the hat over once more in his hands, looking for a moment younger than his years. And thank you, ma'am. Truly. I don't know that I ever properly said it that day in the street. too ashamed after to find the words. You do not owe me the words, Leon said. You owe yourself the choice you are making today. That is worth more than any thanks, Ella stayed. Turned out, over the following months, to be one of the steadiest hands on the whole ranch. Quiet and grateful and entirely without the swagger he'd ridden in with under Thorne's employ, and wit took to saying, when the subject came up, that the valley had a strange way of turning its worst days into its best beginnings. If a person was willing to let it. Of Garrett Thorne himself, word came back only in fragments, carried by drovers and traders passing through a man matching his description, causing trouble 2 territories over, running some new scheme on some other unsuspecting town. The particular restless cruelty of a man who had never learned to build anything except other people's fear. Moving on now that this valley had stopped supplying it, Silas found, to his own mild surprise, that he didn't spend much time thinking about him at all. There wasn't room left for it. Not with a barn to finish, and a garden coming up green along the south wall. But a woman beside him every morning who had taught an entire ranch crew to season their beans properly, and had never once, not on her worst day, stopped teasing him about his coffee. Morning came up soft and gold over Iron Hollow, the kind of light that makes even burned wreckage look, for a while, almost gentle. Silas and Leanne rode out together at first light to check the herd, same as they do most mornings from now on. Her mare keeping easy pace beside his gelding. The two of them talking low and unhurried about nothing much, and everything at once. The new barn they'd raise come autumn. The garden she wanted to plant along the south wall. The handful of words in her language he still butchered every single time, and she still laughed at every single time regardless. Nobody in that whole wide waking valley asked any more what she was to him. Didn't need to ask. The answer stood plain in every small, easy motion between them, in the way his hand found hers without either one deciding to reach first, in the way her laughter carried clear and unafraid across land that had once tried very hard to convince her she had no right to laugh on it at all, because that was the whole of it, in the end. Not a rescue, never really a rescue. Not the way the town had first told the story to itself. Two people who had each spent years learning how to survive alone, choosing finally to stop surviving alone. A man who had once sworn at the edge of dark water that he would never again stand still while somebody else was drowning. A woman who had promised her mother, half a world away, that she would not die like something owned. She thought of her mother often, her own hair too fast. Some mornings the way her mother once had. Some habits outliving the hands that taught them. She did not know, and likely never would, whether that promise had reached the small gray room where she'd made it. Half a world and a whole ocean away. But she liked to imagine it had. Liked to imagine her mother, wherever grief and distance had carried her. Somehow knowing that her daughter had kept her word after all, not merely survived, but built something worth surviving for. Both promises somehow. Against every hard, dry mile of the road that had brought them here, had led to exactly the same place. The sun climbed higher over Iron Hollow, gold spilling long and warm across land that finally, truly belonged to both of them. Somewhere behind them, the new barn stood fresh timbered and pale against the older, weathered out buildings, not yet silvered by sun the way the house had silvered over its many years, but standing all the same solid, proof against every promise Thorn had made about fire and ruin. The herd moved slow and easy across the near pasture. Calves from the branding now half grown and sturdy, and somewhere out past the east fence line, a hawk turned the same slow, patient circle. Old Fang had once watched from beneath the cottonwood, indifferent to human grief or human triumph both, simply riding the same currents it had always ridden, long before any of this valley's troubles, and long after they would finally fully fade. Silas Merrick rode beside the woman he loved with his hand loose and easy on the reins, no longer needing to hold it high and stubborn against the world. He had found at last the one thing worth keeping it raised before, and he never once looked back.